She married a man the entire city feared. Not for love, not for money, but because he held her father's life in one hand and a diamond ring in the other. What Maren Alcott didn't know was that the contract she signed wasn't a marriage. It was a cage, and the man inside it with her was more dangerous than the enemies outside. This is the story of how a trauma nurse from the south side of Chicago walked into the darkest empire in the city, and how the empire was never the same. Stay with me until the end. Hit like. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Part 1. The night everything changed, Maren Alcott smelled like blood that wasn't hers. She came through the emergency exit of Mercy General at 2:14 a.m., still wearing the scrub she'd bled through during a 6-hour surgery on a 14-year-old boy who'd caught a stray round on the Red Line platform. The boy lived. Maren's hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, and she couldn't tell if the tremor was fatigue or rage, or just her body reminding her that 28 years of surviving on the south side of Chicago had not, in fact, made her immune to any of it. January in Chicago was not cold. Cold was a word for places that experienced winter as an inconvenience. Chicago in January was an assault, the wind off Lake Michigan hitting exposed skin like a blade, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your eyes water and your lungs burn with every breath, as if the air itself had decided you didn't deserve to be outside. Maren pulled her parka tighter, tucked her chin into the collar, and started walking. She didn't own a car, couldn't afford one. The math was simple and brutal. $187,000 in student debt, a salary that covered rent and groceries and exactly nothing else, and a bus pass that expired in 3 days. She walked the 11 blocks to her apartment most nights because the bus stopped running at 1 a.m., and cabs cost money she'd already spent on keeping the lights on. The black vehicle was parked beside the emergency entrance. Not a limousine, something heavier, meaner, lower to the ground, the kind of car that looked like it had been designed not for transportation but for survival. Armored panels. Bulletproof glass so thick it made the windows look like the eyes of something dead. The engine was running, exhaust curling up into the frozen air in white plumes that dissolved against the dark sky. Maren noticed it the way she noticed everything in this neighborhood. Quickly, peripherally, without breaking stride. Expensive cars outside hospitals at 2 a.m. meant one of two things. Someone powerful was dying inside, or someone powerful was waiting outside. Either way, it wasn't her problem. She was 12 steps past the vehicle when the rear door opened. "Ms. Alcott," the voice came from inside the car. Male. Calm. The kind of calm that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with authority. The voice of a man who had never needed to raise it because the world rearranged itself around his volume. Maren stopped. She didn't turn around. Her hand went to the pocket of her parka where she kept a small canister of pepper spray, a gift from a coworker who'd been mugged twice on this same block. "I'm armed," she said, "and I've had the kind of night where I'd enjoy using it." A pause. Then, from inside the car, "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to talk about your father." Maren's hand froze on the pepper spray. Her father, Gordon Alcott. The man who'd disappeared 3 years ago. No note, no call, no forwarding address. The man she'd reported missing to a police department that took the report, filed it, and never followed up. The man she'd spent 11 months searching for with every resource available to a broke trauma nurse, which meant internet searches and phone calls, and one private investigator who charged her $4,000 she didn't have and produced nothing. Her father was gone. Had been gone. The grief had calcified into something harder than grief, a scar tissue of acceptance layered over a wound that never fully closed. And now a voice from inside an armored car was speaking his name at 2 a.m. outside the hospital where she'd just saved a child's life. She turned. The interior of the car was dark. Leather seats, the color of midnight. A faint glow from an overhead reading lamp that illuminated the man sitting in the far corner with the precision of a Renaissance painting, light finding the subject, shadow consuming everything else. Dominic Vasaro was 32 years old, and he looked like a man who had been 32 for a very long time. Not aged, not weathered, compressed. As if the years had been packed tighter in him than in other people. Every experience condensed into a density that showed in the stillness of his posture, the economy of his movements, the way his dark eyes tracked her face with the patient, analytical intensity of a predator that had already decided whether to strike and was now simply choosing the moment. He was handsome in the way that expensive weapons are handsome, precisely engineered, perfectly balanced, designed for a purpose that had nothing to do with aesthetics. Sharp jaw, dark hair pushed back from a face that gave nothing away. Wearing black, not the dramatic black of a man making a statement, but the functional black of a man who'd stopped thinking about what he wore because clothing was irrelevant to the things that mattered. Maren knew who he was. Everyone in Chicago knew who Dominic Vasaro was, the way everyone in a forest knows which shadow belongs to the wolf. His name circulated through the city's bloodstream like a low-grade fever, present in whispered conversations at police precincts and city council meetings, and the kind of bars where men drank with their backs to the wall. He controlled the ports. He owned judges. He had financial interests in construction firms and real estate developments and political campaigns that spanned the entire state, and beneath all of it, like bedrock beneath a city, ran the darker infrastructure, the network of loyalty and violence and carefully managed fear that made everything above it possible. People didn't say his name loudly. People didn't say his name at all, if they could help it. And he was sitting in the back of an armored car outside her hospital, saying her father's name like it was a card he'd been holding for a long time, waiting for exactly the right moment to play. "Get in," he said. "No." "Your father is alive, Miss Alcott. If you'd like him to stay that way, I suggest you get in the car." Maren stood in the freezing dark. The wind cut through her parka. Her scrubs were still damp with sweat from the surgery. Her hands were still trembling. Somewhere inside the hospital behind her, a 14-year-old boy was breathing because of the work those hands had done. And somewhere out in the world, her father was breathing too, and the man in this car was telling her that the second fact was contingent on what she did in the next 30 seconds. She got in the car. The door closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling. The interior was warm. The leather seat was the most comfortable thing she'd sat on in months, and she hated it immediately. Hated the luxury, hated the ease, hated the way her exhausted body wanted to sink into it and stay. Dominic Vasaro watched her settle. He didn't offer his hand, didn't smile, didn't perform any of the social rituals that normal people use to establish trust. He simply waited, with the patience of a man who understood that silence was a tool and knew exactly how to use it. Maren spoke first. She refused to let him control the tempo. "Where is my father?" "Safe, for now." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting until we've discussed terms." "Terms for what?" Dominic reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, slowly, deliberately, making sure she saw the movement and understood it was not a threat, and produced a small black box. He opened it. Inside, a diamond ring sat on dark velvet. The stone caught the overhead light and fractured it into a spectrum of cold fire, beautiful and sharp and completely without warmth. "I need a wife," he said, "for 6 months. The marriage will be public, legal, and convincing. In exchange, your father lives, your debts are cleared, and at the end of the contract, you walk away with enough money to start over anywhere in the world." Maren stared at the ring, then at him, then at the ring again. "You're insane." "I'm practical. There's a difference. You're asking me to marry you. I'm offering you a transaction. Romance is not involved." "Why me?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not a softening. Dominic Vasaro didn't soften, but a recalibration, as if her question had touched a circuit he'd prefer to keep hidden. "Because you have no connections to my world, no criminal history, no political affiliations. You're a trauma nurse from the South Side with a clean record and a missing father. You're invisible in all the ways that matter, and visible in all the ways I need." "Visible how?" "Sympathetic, authentic. The kind of woman people believe a man like me might actually fall for. The story writes itself. The powerful man humbled by the ordinary woman. It's a narrative that buys me political cover, public goodwill, and 6 months of protection against an enemy who is coming for everything I have." "What enemy?" "That's not your concern." "If I'm marrying you, it's my concern." Another shift, smaller this time. A flicker of something behind his eyes that might have been respect or might have been annoyance. With Dominic, the two were probably interchangeable. "His name is Elias Crane. He's a former intelligence operative who built a shadow empire designed to consume mine. He's patient, methodical, and he has no weaknesses I can exploit. The marriage changes the political landscape. It creates alliances I can't build alone and freezes financial channels Crane needs for his operation. It's a strategic move, nothing more. And my father? Your father uncovered files that are dangerous to both Crane and me. I'm keeping him alive because dead men can't be managed. If you agree to this, his safety is guaranteed for the duration of the contract. If you refuse, you'll kill him. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Silence. The car hummed. Outside, a siren wailed to an ambulance pulling into the emergency bay, carrying someone else's disaster. The sound was so familiar to Maren, it was almost comforting, the way a lullaby is comforting. Not because of the melody, but because of the repetition. I need time to think, she said. You have until the end of this car ride. That's not time. That's a threat. It's a deadline. There's a difference. Maren looked at the ring again. The diamond was flawless. She knew enough about gems from her mother, who'd worked at a jewelry counter in a department store for 22 years before the cancer, to recognize a stone worth more than everything she'd ever owned combined. It was the kind of ring that existed in a world she'd only seen from the outside, through windows she'd never been invited to enter. And now a man was offering her a key, not out of kindness, not out of love, out of utility. She was a tool, a prop, a piece of stage dressing for a performance designed to keep an empire alive. She thought about her father, the way he used to cook breakfast on Sunday mornings, burnt pancakes and too strong coffee, and the sports section spread across the kitchen table. The way he'd taught her to drive in an empty parking lot, his hand gripping the dashboard, his voice steady even when she almost hit a light pole. The way he'd disappeared without a word and left a hole in her life so large, she'd had to build her entire identity around the edges of it just to keep functioning. She thought about the debt, the $187,000 that grew every month like a tumor she couldn't excise. The collection calls, the garnished wages, the specific grinding humiliation of being a woman who saved lives for a living and couldn't afford to save herself. She thought about this boy on the operating table, 14 years old, bullet lodged a centimeter from his spine. She'd held his heart in her hands, not metaphorically, actually, physically held his heart while the surgeon repaired a nicked artery. And she'd kept him alive because that was what she did. She kept people alive. It was the only thing she'd ever been good at, and now someone was telling her she could keep her father alive too. All it cost was 6 months and a ring and the complete surrender of everything she'd built as an independent human being. If I do this, she said, I have conditions. Name them. I see my father, in person, before the wedding. I need proof he's alive and unharmed. Agreed. The contract is reviewed by an independent lawyer of my choosing, not yours, mine. Agreed. I continue working at the hospital, my shifts, my schedule, my patients. This arrangement doesn't touch my career. A pause. Longer than the others. Your schedule will require modifications for public appearances, but the hospital stays. And when it's over, the 6 months, I walk away clean. No surveillance, no obligations, no contact unless I initiate it. Dominic studied her. The reading lamp cast shadows beneath his cheekbones that made his face look carved from something harder than flesh. Agreed, he said. Then we have a deal. She reached for the ring box. Her fingers were steady. She made them steady, the same way she made them steady when she was suturing a wound or debriding a burn or holding a beating heart. Steady hands were not a gift. They were a discipline, a choice she made 700 times a day in the ER, and she made it now in the back of this armored car, reaching for a diamond that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet calculate. She took the ring, did not put it on, closed the box, and held it in her lap. I'll wear it when the performance starts, she said. Not before. Something crossed Dominic's face, fast, barely visible, like a fish moving beneath dark water. Not a smile. Something more complicated. Something that looked, for one fraction of a second, almost like pain. The car will take you home, he said. Tomorrow at noon, a driver will bring you to my attorney's office. The contract will be ready for review. We begin in 72 hours. Begin what exactly? Making the world believe that I'm in love. He said it flatly, without irony, without warmth. the way a man might describe the specifications of a building he was about to construct: materials, dimensions, load-bearing capacity. Love as architecture, love as infrastructure, love as a strategic asset deployed in the service of an empire. Maren opened the car door. The cold hit her like a wall. She stepped out onto the frozen sidewalk and stood there for a moment, the ring box in her pocket, the wind cutting through her scrubs, the armored car already pulling away into the dark. She walked home. 11 blocks. The streets were empty. Her breath came in white clouds that hung in the air behind her like ghosts. She was leaving in her wake. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry, too wired, too full of the specific chemical cocktail that follows a life-or-death surgery. Adrenaline fading into cortisol, fading into the hollow, buzzing emptiness that would eventually become sleep if she was lucky. Her apartment was a studio on the 3rd floor of a building that should have been condemned. The hallway smelled like cooking grease and mildew. The door had 2 locks, both of them cheap. Inside, a mattress on the floor, a kitchen counter with a hot plate and a coffee maker, medical textbooks stacked against the wall, and a single watercolor painting she'd done in college. A rain-smeared Chicago skyline that she'd hung above the mattress because it was the only beautiful thing she owned. She sat on the mattress, took the ring box from her pocket, opened it. The diamond caught the light from the street lamp outside her window and threw fractured rainbows across the water-stained ceiling. Maren Alcott, 28, alone, exhausted, $187,000 in debt, holding a diamond worth more than her life, in a room worth less than the box it came in, made the first calculation of many that would follow. She was going to marry Dominic Vasaro, not because she wanted to, not because she believed him, not because the terms were fair or the arrangement was safe, or the man himself was anything less than terrifying. Because her father was alive, and she was the kind of woman who held beating hearts in her hands and refused to let go. That was the beginning. Not a love story. Not yet. Something raw. Something with teeth. She closed the ring box, lay back on the mattress, stared at the ceiling until the street lamp shadows moved and the sky outside began to lighten, and the city woke up around her the way it always did, violently, indifferently, without the slightest concern for the woman lying in a 3rd-floor apartment who had just agreed to sell 6 months of her life to a man the entire city feared. At noon the next day, a black sedan arrived outside her building. The driver was a thick-necked man who said nothing and drove with the focused intensity of someone who'd been trained to navigate hostile environments at high speed. He took her downtown to a law office on the 42nd floor of a glass tower on LaSalle Street, the kind of building that existed to remind people who entered it that money was a language, and they didn't speak it fluently enough. The attorney's name was Whitfield, 50-something, silver hair, the deliberate, overfed confidence of a man who'd spent decades protecting people from the consequences of their worst decisions. He sat across from Maren at a conference table long enough to land a small aircraft on and walked her through 46 pages of legal architecture. Marriage certificate pre-filed with Cook County. Financial terms. All debts cleared upon signing, a monthly stipend deposited into a new account, a lump sum payment upon completion of the 6-month term. Behavioral clauses. Public appearances as scheduled, physical proximity as required for appearances. No disclosure of the arrangement's true nature to any third party under penalty of the language was vague, deliberately so. The kind of legal fog that could mean a lawsuit or something much worse. Non-disclosure agreement. 23 pages of it, covering every possible category of information Maren might encounter during the arrangement: names, locations, financial details, conversations, the architecture of Dominic's operations. She read every word. Whitfield shifted in his chair. He wasn't used to clients who read. On page 31, buried inside a subsection titled Dissolution Terms, she found it. A clause allowing the initiating party, Dominic, to extend the marriage beyond 6 months at his sole discretion. No mutual consent, no advance notice requirement, just a line of legal text that essentially said, he decides when this ends, not you. Maren set down the page, looked at Whitfield. This clause stays in the contract. I walk out of this room and I don't come back. Whitfield blinked. Ms. Alcott, this is a standard protective. There's nothing standard about any of this. Remove it. I don't have the authority to Then call someone who does. Whitfield left the room. Maren sat alone at the conference table, 42 stories above a city that had no idea what was happening in this room, and stared at the page until the words blurred. The clause was a trap door, a failsafe, the kind of provision a man like Dominic built into every agreement because control wasn't just a strategy for him, it was a survival mechanism. He controlled because he couldn't afford not to. He built cages because somewhere in his history, someone had taught him that cages kept you safe. She didn't know that yet. She'd learn it later, in a dark kitchen at 2 a.m., standing 3 feet from a man showing her a scar on his wrist. But she felt it now. The shadow of it, the architecture of damage that produced a clause like this. Whitfield returned 11 minutes later, revised page. The clause was gone. Maren signed. She kept the original page with the buried clause, folded it neatly, and slid it into the inside pocket of her parka. Not evidence. A reminder. A small paper monument to the truth about the man she was marrying, that his first instinct, always, was to build a door that only he could open. 2 days later, the performance began. Dominic's people, she came to think of them as the machine, arrived at the penthouse at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday. Stylists, a wardrobe consultant, a woman named Tatiana who spoke exclusively in commands and pinned Maren into a charcoal dress that fit like it had been engineered for her body by someone who'd studied her measurements without permission. The penthouse itself was a statement. 70th floor. Panoramic windows wrapping the entire north face of the building, framing the Chicago skyline like a painting you could walk into. Concrete floors polished to a mirror finish. Furniture that looked like it had been designed by someone who found comfort suspicious. A kitchen with appliances Maren couldn't identify, and a refrigerator stocked with food she'd never tasted. And everywhere, the silent presence of security. Men in tailored suits with the particular stillness of professionals trained in close protection. The kind of stillness that looked like patience but was actually readiness, every muscle coiled, every angle calculated, waiting for a violence that might never come but would be met without hesitation if it did. Dominic briefed her in the living room while Tatiana adjusted the hem of her dress with pins held between her teeth. Tonight is a charity event at the Drake. 700 guests. You stay within arm's reach. When I touch you, don't react. If someone asks about us, keep it vague. I pursued you, you resisted, I was persistent. Don't speak to anyone alone. Don't accept drinks you didn't watch being poured. And if a man named Arturo De Luca approaches you, smile, say nothing, and find me immediately. Who's Arturo De Luca? Someone who works for people who want me dead. The casualness of the statement was more frightening than the content. He said it the way she might say someone who works in accounting. A biographical detail, not a threat assessment. Anything else? Yes, the ring. Maren looked at her left hand. Bare. She'd kept the ring in its box since the night in the car, untouched, a small act of resistance she hadn't consciously planned but had maintained with quiet stubbornness. Dominic held out his hand. Open. Waiting. She took the ring from her pocket. Put it on herself. She didn't let him do it. That distinction mattered. Not to the audience they were about to perform for, but to her. The diamond settled onto her finger with a weight that was disproportionate to its size, as if the stone carried the mass of every decision that had led to this moment. Her father's disappearance, her mother's death, the debt, the exhaustion, the boy on the operating table, the armored car in the dark. Let's go, she said. The Drake Hotel ballroom was a cathedral of wealth and performance. Crystal chandeliers threw prismatic light across 700 guests dressed in the kind of clothing that Maren had only ever seen in magazines at her dentist's office. The air smelled like perfume and champagne and the faint metallic undertone of ambition. Music, a 12-piece orchestra, drifted through the room like weather. Dominic placed his hand on the small of her back as they entered. His palm was large, warm, and steady. She felt every finger through the thin fabric of her dress like a brand being applied, not painfully, but indelibly. This is where I am, the hand said. This is where you are. The space between us is closed. The room turned toward them the way a field of sunflowers turns toward the sun. Not all at once, but in a slow, cascading wave of attention that rolled from the entrance to the bar to the far corners where the most powerful people stood with their backs to the wall and their drinks held at precisely the right height. Dominic moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who understood that every social interaction was a transaction and he was always the one holding more currency. He introduced Maren to a federal judge with soft hands and hard eyes, to two aldermen who sweated through their shirts and laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny, to the CFO of a shipping company whose smile never reached her eyes and whose handshake was precisely 2 seconds too long. Maren performed. She smiled. She deflected personal questions with the same practiced calm she used to deliver bad news to families in the ER. Warm enough to be believed, vague enough to reveal nothing. She let Dominic's hand rest on her waist and her hip, and the small of her back and the curve of her shoulder, each touch a data point in the public narrative they were constructing. Man and woman, power and grace. The city's most feared figure humanized by the presence of someone who looked like she belonged to a different, gentler world. And she watched. She watched the way men's posture changed in Dominic's proximity, spines straightening, voices lowering, the physical vocabulary of deference that powerful men adopt around men who are more powerful. She watched the women, some curious, some envious, a troubling number who looked at her with a recognition she couldn't name, as if they'd been in similar rooms beside similar men and understood exactly what the ring on her finger actually meant. She watched a heavy-set man in a pinstripe suit pass Dominic a sealed envelope beneath the dinner table with the practiced fluidity of someone who'd done this before. She watched Dominic accept it with a single nod. No words, no acknowledgement, just the mechanical efficiency of a system operating as designed. And she watched Dominic watch her. He was subtle about it. The glances were brief, half a second, maybe less, and always when he thought she was occupied with someone else. But Maren had spent her entire career reading the bodies of people who couldn't tell her what was wrong, and she read his now with the same diagnostic precision. He wasn't performing when he looked at her. The realization was small and quiet and devastating, like a hairline fracture that doesn't show on the first X-ray. At 10 p.m., in the car on the way back to the penthouse, Maren leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. The city slid past in smears of light and cold. "You did well," Dominic said. "Don't grade me." It wasn't a grade, it was an observation. She kept her eyes closed, felt his gaze on her face like heat from an open flame. Not burning, not yet, but close enough that she could feel the temperature change. The distance between them in the back seat was 18 inches. She measured it the way she measured everything, clinically, precisely, with the specific awareness of a woman who needed to know exactly how much space existed between herself and danger. "The man with the envelope," she said. "At dinner. Who was he?" Silence. She opened her eyes. Dominic was looking out his own window. The skyline reflected in his dark eyes like a city built inside his skull. "Not your concern," he said. "Everything in that room is my concern. You put me in it. I have a right to know what I'm standing next to." He turned to look at her. The streetlights strobed across his face. Light, shadow, light, shadow. And in one of the lit moments she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not calculation, surprise. The genuine, unguarded surprise of a man who hadn't expected to be challenged and didn't quite know what to do with the experience. His name is Riccardi. He manages distribution logistics for the Port Authority. Legal logistics or the other kind? The kind that keeps this city functioning in ways the mayor doesn't discuss at press conferences. So, the other kind. Dominic said nothing. The car turned onto Lakeshore Drive. The lake was a black void to their right, featureless, immense, the kind of darkness that swallowed light and sound and gave nothing back. Maren closed her eyes again. Sleep was coming. Not gently, not willingly, but with the blunt inevitability of a body that had been running on adrenaline for 20 hours and had finally exhausted its supply. "Dominic?" "Yes." "The clause you buried in the contract, page 31, the one that let you extend the marriage without my consent." His silence changed texture. She felt it, a shift in the air pressure inside the car, the specific stillness of a man who had been caught and was calculating his response. "I removed it," he said, "because I caught it. Not because you chose to. There's a difference." "Yes, there is. If I find another one, another buried clause, another hidden mechanism, another way you've rigged this arrangement to serve you at my expense, I won't renegotiate. I'll walk. And your 6-month performance loses its leading lady. Silence. The car hummed. The city passed. Understood, he said. Maren kept her eyes closed and let the movement of the car carry her toward something that wasn't quite sleep. A liminal state between consciousness and surrender, where the events of the past 48 hours rearranged themselves into a shape she could almost comprehend. She had signed a contract. She had worn a ring. She had walked into a room full of criminals and politicians and smiled like a woman in love. And somewhere in the margins of the performance, in the half-second glances and the carefully rationed touches and the silence that lived between Dominic Vasaro's words, something was happening that she hadn't planned for and couldn't control. He was looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching, and she was watching him watch her, and neither of them was performing when they did it. That night, alone in the bedroom she'd been assigned, separate from his, one locked door between them, Maren sat on the floor with a legal pad and began writing down every name, every face, every interaction from the evening. She didn't know what she was building yet, but the shape of it was forming, a map, a web, the anatomy of a machine built on money and violence and the specific silence of people who feared the same man. She wrote until 3 a.m. Then she set the pen down, climbed into the bed that cost more than her annual rent, and stared at the ceiling. The diamond on her left hand caught the moonlight filtering through the penthouse windows and threw a single fractured rainbow across the wall, delicate, temporary, already fading by the time her eyes focused on it. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow the performance would continue. More galas, more dinners, more of Dominic's hand on her back and his eyes on her face and the slow, inexorable compression of the distance between them. But tonight, in the dark, Maren allowed herself one honest thought, the kind of thought she'd never say aloud and would deny under oath. She wasn't just afraid of Dominic Vasaro. She was afraid of the part of herself that had stopped wanting to leave. And that fear, quiet, private, lodged in the space between her ribs like a splinter she couldn't reach, was more dangerous than anything the man in the next room could do to her. Because Maren Alcott had survived poverty and grief and debt and the slow erosion of hope that came from saving other people's lives while her own fell apart. She'd survived all of it by building walls, by refusing to need anyone, by turning her loneliness into a discipline and her independence into a fortress. Dominic Vasaro wasn't attacking the fortress. He was making her want to open the gate. And that, the wanting, the slow dissolution of her own defenses in the presence of a man who was simultaneously her captor and her protector, and something else she didn't have a name for yet, was the cliffhanger she couldn't resolve. The unanswered question that would follow her into sleep and greet her when she woke and grow louder with every day she spent inside his world. Was she performing, or had the performance already become something real? The penthouse settled into its nocturnal silence. Security guards changed shifts in the hallway. The elevator hummed. The city breathed its 10 million breaths 70 stories below. And Maren Alcott lay in the dark with a ring on her finger and a map on the floor and the growing, terrible certainty that the 6 months she'd agreed to were not going to end the way either of them planned. The first morning Maren woke in the penthouse, she didn't know where she was. Not metaphorically, literally. The ceiling was 14 feet above her, pale concrete, seamless, like the inside of a vault. The sheets were white and heavy, thread count so high they felt like water against her skin. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling glass and lit up Lake Michigan in a blinding sheet of silver. For 3 full seconds she lay perfectly still, her brain cycling through every possible explanation. Kidnapped, drugged, dead. Before the diamond on her left hand caught the light, and memory crashed back like a wave breaking against stone. She sat up. Her scrubs from the night before were folded on a chair she didn't recognize. Someone had removed her shoes while she slept. That detail alone made her stomach turn. Maren pressed her bare feet against the cold marble floor and stood. The bedroom was enormous, minimalist, brutally clean. No photographs, no personal objects. A walk-in closet stood open to her left, and inside it hung rows of women's clothing. Her size, her preferred cuts, colors she actually wore, organized with the precision of a retail display. Tags still attached, shoes lined up beneath, 3 coats for different weather. She touched nothing. Instead, she walked barefoot through the hallway toward the sound of low voices and found the kitchen, an open steel and stone expanse where a man she'd never seen before was making coffee. He was mid-40s, heavy across the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been broken and reassembled more than once. He wore a shoulder holster over a white dress shirt. The gun sat against his ribs like it had grown there. He glanced at her without expression. Coffee's ready. He's on the terrace. No name, no introduction, no warmth. Just coordinates. Maren poured her own coffee. Black, no sugar, the mug heavy and ceramic and probably worth more than her rent, and walked to the terrace doors. The cold hit her instantly. Chicago in January felt like a punishment, and 70 floors up the wind was a living thing, shoving against her body, pulling at the thin shirt someone had apparently changed her into while she slept. She stopped thinking about that. She had to. Dominic Vasaro stood at the glass railing with a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in Italian so rapid and clipped it sounded less like language and more like the mechanical cycling of a weapon. He wore a black overcoat, no scarf, no gloves. His hair was pushed back from his face, and in the gray morning light she could see him clearly for the first time without the theatrical shadows of the car interior. He was younger than she'd assumed. 32, maybe 33. The kind of face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so deliberately closed. Sharp jaw, dark eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow. A mouth that looked like it had been designed for cruelty but trained into stillness. He held himself with the rigid economy of someone who had learned very early that relaxation was a luxury he couldn't afford. He ended the call without saying goodbye. Turned to her. Studied her face for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to catalog her state of mind, short enough to pretend he hadn't. "You slept 4 hours," he said. "That's not enough." "Who changed my clothes?" The question came out harder than she intended. Good. She wanted it hard. Dominic didn't blink. "Elena, my housekeeper. She's worked for my family for 20 years. No one else entered the room." "And the closet?" "Stocked 3 days ago. 3 days before you showed up at my hospital." He said nothing. He didn't need to. The implication was a completed sentence hanging between them like smoke. Maren took a sip of coffee. It burned her tongue, and she let it, grateful for a sensation that belonged to her. "I want to see proof that my father is alive. Not a photograph, not a recording, a live video call. Today. That can be arranged. And I want access to the terms of this arrangement in writing, signed, witnessed, with an exit clause that doesn't require your permission." Dominic tilted his head slightly. It was the first time she'd seen him react to anything with something resembling interest. "You've done this before?" "Done what?" "Negotiated with someone who could kill you. I work in a level 1 trauma center on the south side of Chicago. I negotiate with people who could kill me every night. You're just better dressed." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. She wasn't sure his face remembered how, but a micro-adjustment, a loosening around the eyes that lasted less than a second before it vanished. "You'll have the documents by noon," he said. "The call with your father happens at 2. After that, we begin." "Begin what?" "Making Chicago believe I'm in love." He said it the way someone else might say, making dinner or catching a train. Flat. Operational. Like love was a task on a list, and he'd already moved past it. Maren held his gaze until the wind made her eyes water, then turned and went back inside. She did not look back. She counted that as a victory. The documents arrived at 11:47 a.m. A lawyer named Kessler, no relation, she'd later learn, to the man who would eventually try to destroy them both, sat across from her at the dining table and walked her through 46 pages of legal architecture so dense it might as well have been written in code. Marriage certificate pre-filed. Financial terms. Behavioral expectations. A non-disclosure agreement broad enough to cover everything from pillow talk to criminal prosecution. Maren read every word. The lawyer watched her with the specific discomfort of a man who expected her to skim and sign. She didn't skim. On page 31, she found it. A clause buried inside a subsection on dissolution terms that stated the marriage could be extended beyond 6 months at the discretion of the initiating party. No mutual consent required. No notification obligation. She looked up at the lawyer. "This clause allows him to extend the marriage indefinitely without my agreement." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. That's a standard protective measure for remove it or I don't sign. Ms. Alcott, I'm not authorized to be. Then get authorized. Silence. The lawyer excused himself, made a phone call in the hallway, returned 11 minutes later with a revised page and a pen. Maren signed, but she kept the original page with the buried clause, folded it neatly and slid it into the pocket of her borrowed robe. Not because she needed evidence, because she needed to remember what Dominic Vasaro was capable of when he thought no one was reading the fine print. Each. The video call with her father lasted 9 minutes. Gordon Alcott appeared on a laptop screen propped on the dining table, seated in a room she didn't recognize. White walls, minimal furniture, a window showing what might have been a coastal landscape or might have been a screensaver. He looked older than she remembered, thinner. His hair had gone completely gray and his hands shook slightly when he raised them to the camera. Maren. His voice cracked on the second syllable. Jesus. Maren. Dad. She gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Are you hurt? No, they're treating me fine. Where are you? What did he, I'm safe. I'm handling it. Handling what? Maren, listen to me. The files I found, the transactions, it's bigger than you think. Vasaro's network touches. The screen went black. Maren stared at the dead laptop. Behind her, Dominic stood in the kitchen doorway with his phone in his hand, thumb still hovering over whatever command had killed the connection. What did you just do? The call exceeded the security window. He was telling me something. He was telling you something that would make you a target for the people listening. You said the line was secure. No line is secure. The line was monitored by my people, which means anything your father says about those files is now recorded and stored in a system that could be compromised. Maren stood up. The chair scraped against marble with a sound like a small scream. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and stopped close enough to smell him. Cedar, cold air. Something darker underneath, like gunpowder embedded in wool. You gave me 9 minutes with my father, 9 minutes in 3 years, and you cut him off the moment he started telling me the truth. I cut him off the moment the truth became dangerous. Dangerous to who? To me or to you? Dominic looked at her. That same flat, cataloging stare. Except this time she saw something underneath it. A flicker of calculation. Yes, but also something that looked almost like pain, suppressed so quickly she might have imagined it. Both, he said. Maren held his gaze for a long, burning moment. Then she turned and walked to the bedroom and closed the door with the kind of measured control that was louder than any slam. She sat on the edge of the bed, pressed both hands flat against her thighs, breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, the way she taught panicking patients in the ER. She was in a cage. A beautiful 70-story marble and glass cage with a view of a city she used to love, and a man whose every kindness had a strategic purpose. She had signed the contract. There was no going back. But Gordon Alcott's unfinished sentence played on loop behind her eyelids like a film stuck on repeat. Vasaro's network touches what? She intended to find out. The public performance began 3 days later. Dominic's people, a team Maren came to think of as the Machine, orchestrated everything. Stylists arrived at 6 a.m. Hair, makeup, wardrobe. A woman named Tatiana, who spoke exclusively in directives, pinned Maren into a black cocktail dress that fit like it had been sewn onto her body and told her to stop slouching. The event was a charity gala at the Drake Hotel. Cancer research, 700 guests, enough political and financial power in one ballroom to restructure a small country. Maren stood in the penthouse elevator beside Dominic and stared at their reflection in the polished steel doors. They looked like a magazine cover. Her in black silk, him in a charcoal suit cut so precisely it seemed to sharpen the air around him. The diamond on her finger threw fractured light against the elevator walls. Rules, Dominic said without looking at her. I'm listening. Stay within arm's reach. If someone asks how we met, I pursued you. You resisted. I was persistent. Keep it vague. If a woman named Margaret Hale approaches you, smile and say nothing. She records conversations on her phone. If a man named Arturo De Luca tries to speak to you alone, do not let him. He works for people who want me dead. Anything else? When I touch you, don't flinch. The elevator doors opened. A wall of sound and light hit them. Music, voices, the crystalline clink of champagne flutes. Dominic placed his hand on the small of her back. His palm was warm, steady, and enormous. She felt every finger like a brand through the thin silk. She didn't flinch. They walked into the ballroom, and the room rearranged itself around them like iron filings snapping toward a magnet. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A woman in a red gown whispered something to her husband that made his eyebrows climb toward his hairline. Dominic moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who understood that social events were just warfare conducted at lower volume. He introduced Maren to a federal judge, 2 aldermen, the CFO of a shipping conglomerate, and a woman who ran a private equity firm that Maren was fairly certain was a laundering operation. Each introduction was brief, precise, loaded with subtext she could feel but not decode. She played her part, smiled, deflected, let Dominic's hand rest on her waist like she was used to it, like his touch was something she'd chosen rather than contracted. And she watched. She watched the way men's body language changed around Dominic. The straightened spines, the lowered eyes, the careful distance they maintained as if his personal space was electrified. She watched the way women looked at her, some with curiosity, some with envy. More than a few with pity, they tried to disguise as admiration. She watched a heavy-set man in a pinstripe suit hand Dominic a sealed envelope beneath the table during dinner and receive a single nod in return. She watched all of it with the clinical detachment of a nurse assessing a patient's vitals. Every detail was data. Every interaction was a symptom of something larger. By 10 p.m., she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with her body. The constant performance, the vigilance, the awareness that a single wrong word could unravel months of planning. It was a different kind of fatigue than hospital work, deeper, more corrosive. In the car on the way back, she leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. The city slid past in smears of light and shadow. "You did well," Dominic said from beside her. She didn't open her eyes. "Don't grade me." A pause. Then, quietly, "It wasn't a grade. It was an observation." She felt his gaze on the side of her face like heat from an open flame. She kept her eyes closed and said nothing, and eventually the weight of his attention shifted away and she could breathe again. That night, alone in the bedroom she'd been assigned, separate from his, one locked door between them, Maren sat cross-legged on the floor with a stolen legal pad and began writing down every name, every face, every interaction she'd cataloged at the gala. She didn't know what she was building yet, but she knew the shape of it. A map, a web, the anatomy of a machine built on money and violence and silence, and somewhere inside it, the unfinished sentence her father had tried to give her. Vasaro's network touches. She would finish that sentence herself. Wumake. 2 weeks in, then 3. The calendar moved like a slow hemorrhage, each day indistinguishable from the last, marked only by the accumulation of small, dangerous details. Maren's shifts at the hospital continued, but reshaped. Dominic's people drove her, waited outside, drove her back. Her colleagues noticed the armored SUV, the driver who never smiled, the ring that caught the fluorescent lights in the break room. Rumors moved through the hospital like a virus. Some thought she was dating a businessman. Others guessed closer to the truth and stopped meeting her eyes. She told no one. The NDA was a leash, and she felt it with every conversation that required a lie. At the penthouse, a routine calcified. Mornings, coffee, briefings from Dominic's chief of security, a man named Novak who communicated primarily through grunts and tactical projections on a wall-mounted screen. Afternoons, hospital shifts, or increasingly, social engagements choreographed by the machine. Evenings, silence, separate dinners, separate rooms. A no-man's land of hallways and closed doors where they coexisted like 2 patients in adjacent hospital beds, aware of each other's breathing, never touching. But the no-man's land was shrinking. One night, the 17th night, not that she was counting, Maren couldn't sleep. She wandered to the kitchen at 2 a.m. and found Dominic already there, standing in the dark with a glass of whiskey and his shirt untucked, which was the most disheveled she had ever seen him. He looked different without the armor of his suits. Younger, more human. The tendons in his forearms were visible, and there was a scar on his left wrist she hadn't noticed before. Thin, white, surgical, running from the base of his palm to the edge of his sleeve. He saw her looking at it. "A gift," he said, "from my father. I was 14. I disagreed with a business decision." Maren said nothing. She poured herself water from the tap, deliberately not from the filtered dispenser, and stood at the opposite counter. "Your father broke your wrist because you disagreed with him." "He didn't break it. He had someone else break it. He watched." The casual delivery was worse than any display of emotion could have been. He said it the way you'd describe a traffic delay. Factual. Historicized. Stripped of every feeling until it was nothing but data. Maren recognized the technique. She'd used it herself. In therapy sessions, she stopped attending after 3 weeks because she couldn't afford the copay. You flatten the trauma until it sounds like someone else's story. You tell it without inflection. You survive it by refusing to feel it. "Is he still alive?" she asked. "Your father." "No." The single syllable contained an entire history she knew better than to ask about. They stood in the dark kitchen for 11 minutes without speaking. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. It was the first honest thing they'd shared. The silence of two people who understood that some wounds don't heal, they just stop bleeding. When Maren finally turned to leave, Dominic said her name. Just her name. No sentence attached. She paused in the doorway, but didn't turn around. "What?" A beat. Then, "Nothing. Good night." She walked back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands against her chest because her heart was doing something she hadn't authorized and she needed it to stop. The cracks in the arrangement widened the following week when Novak, Dominic's security chief, pulled Maren aside after a morning briefing and told her, in his flat, affectless monotone, that there had been a communication intercept. Someone inside Dominic's organization was leaking information to Elias Crane. Not operational details. Something worse. Personal details. Maren's schedule. Her hospital shifts. The route her driver took between the penthouse and Mercy General. The name she used at the pharmacy where she filled her prescriptions. "Someone is building a file on you," Novak said. "From the inside." Maren felt the blood drain from her face. She'd felt watched before. You didn't live with Dominic Vasaro without the constant sensation of surveillance. But this was different. This was someone close enough to know the texture of her daily life, feeding it to a man who wanted to use it as a weapon. "Does Dominic know?" "He knows." "And?" Novak looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "He's handling it." "Handling it how?" "The way he handles everything, Ms. Alcott." She found Dominic in his office. A room she'd never entered, a space that felt less like a workspace and more like the interior of a predator's mind. Screens along one wall showed security feeds, financial dashboards, encrypted message threads. He was standing behind a glass desk with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, speaking to two men she'd never seen before in a tone so low she couldn't make out the words. He saw her in the doorway, dismissed the men with a gesture. They left without looking at her. "Someone is selling my schedule to Elias Crane," she said. "And you didn't tell me." "I found out 40 minutes ago." "And in 40 minutes you told Novak, but not me." "Novak is responsible for your security." "I am responsible for my security. That was true before I met you, and it's true now. I have a right to know when someone inside your house is targeting me." Dominic leaned both hands on the desk. The tendons in his forearms flexed. She could see the scar on his wrist again, and for one irrational moment she wanted to touch it, and the impulse made her angry. At herself, at him, at the entire architecture of this arrangement that was slowly, methodically dismantling the boundaries she'd spent a lifetime constructing. "You're right," he said. She hadn't expected that. "What?" "You're right. I should have told you first. It won't happen again." Maren studied his face, searching for the angle, the calculation, the strategic reason behind the concession. She couldn't find one, and that was more unsettling than any manipulation would have been. "Who is it?" she asked. "The leak." "I don't know yet." "But you have suspects." "I have suspects." "How many people have access to my schedule?" 7. "Then you have 7 suspects. Narrow it down." He looked at her. Really looked. Not the cataloging glance or the tactical assessment, but a long, unguarded stare that made the room feel smaller and the air feel thinner. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You don't get to expect things about me. You get to honor the contract and keep my father alive. Everything else is none of your business." She turned and walked out before her voice could betray her, because the truth was that his unguarded stare had done something to her chest that felt like a defibrillator, a single, violent shock that restarted something she'd thought was dead. Dominic narrowed the suspects to 3 within 48 hours. He told Maren nothing about his methods, and she didn't ask because she understood that the answer would involve things she wasn't prepared to carry. But the leak wasn't the only crack spreading through the foundation. The social engagements intensified. 2 galas in 1 week. A private dinner with a state senator who spent the entire evening staring at Maren's neckline while his wife pretended not to notice. A Sunday brunch at a Gold Coast estate where a woman named Catherine Aldridge, old Chicago money, surgically preserved, with a smile like a paper cut, cornered Maren in the powder room and asked, in a voice sweet enough to rot teeth, how a girl from the South Side managed to catch Dominic Vasaro. "I didn't catch him," Maren said, drying her hands with deliberate calm. "He caught me." Catherine's smile widened. "Oh, sweetheart, men like Dominic don't catch. They collect." Maren dropped the towel in the wastebasket and walked out without another word. But the comment lodged beneath her skin like a splinter she couldn't reach, because it echoed something she'd been trying not to think. Was she a partner or a possession? Did the distinction even matter to a man who operated in a world where everything, loyalty, love, life itself, was transactional? She started testing boundaries, small ones at first. She rearranged the kitchen without asking, changed the coffee brand, left her watercolor supplies on the dining table instead of hiding them in her room. Each act was minor, almost petty, but what she was really measuring was Dominic's response. Would he correct her, control her, reassert ownership over his space? He did none of those things. The watercolors stayed on the table. The coffee brand changed. When she left a half-finished painting on the kitchen counter, a moody, rain-streaked abstraction of the Chicago skyline, she came back the next morning to find it leaning against the window in the living room, positioned to catch the morning light. He hadn't moved it to a better location. He'd moved it to the best location. The angle was perfect. The light hit the painting in a way that revealed layers of color she hadn't consciously noticed while working. And that attention, that devastating, meticulous attention to a thing she'd made, undid something inside her she didn't know how to reassemble. The engagement gala was Dominic's masterpiece of public theater. The Art Institute's modern wing, closed for a private event. 500 guests. A 12-piece orchestra playing beneath Renzo Piano's floating roof. Ice sculptures shaped like abstract crowns lining the entrance. Security so discreet it was nearly invisible, which meant it was everywhere. Maren wore white, not bridal, architectural. A structured gown that made her look less like a bride-to-be and more like a woman carved from marble and light. Tatiana had outdone herself, and Maren hated that she looked extraordinary, because looking extraordinary meant she was becoming the character, and the character was a fiction, and fictions have a way of consuming the people who create them. Dominic stood beside her at the entrance and placed his hand on her waist. By now the gesture was routine. She no longer flinched. She no longer counted his fingers. And that was the problem, Dad. The erosion of resistance, the slow normalization of his touch, the way her body had begun to accept his proximity without consulting her brain first. The evening blurred. Handshakes, champagne, a toast from a federal prosecutor who owed Dominic favors he'd never publicly acknowledge. Maren smiled until her face ached, spoke until her voice went hoarse, and performed the role of a woman in love with such precision that she occasionally forgot she was performing. Then she excused herself to find the restroom, turned down a service corridor behind the main gallery, and walked directly into Elias Crane. He was leaning against the wall as if he'd been waiting. Maybe he had. He was taller than she'd imagined from the briefings. 6'2", lean, with the angular face of an academic and the eyes of something that hunted at night. He wore a tuxedo that fit him perfectly, which meant he'd been on the guest list, which meant someone had put him there. "Mrs. Vasaro," he said. Almost. Maren's hand went instinctively to her hip, where her phone sat in a concealed pocket. Crane saw the movement and shook his head. "If I wanted to hurt you, you'd already be hurt. I'm here to give you something Dominic never will." "And what's that?" "The truth." He straightened, took one step closer, not threatening, deliberate, the way a doctor moves toward a patient before delivering the diagnosis. Your father's files, the ones he found, they don't just document Elias Crane's operations, they document Dominic's. 3 years of joint transactions, shared accounts, coordinated shipments. Your fiancé and I weren't always enemies, Maren. We were partners. The corridor was cold. Maren's exposed shoulders prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with temperature. You're lying. I'm a lot of things, but right now I'm the only person in this building telling you the truth. Dominic didn't rescue your father from me. He hid your father from you so you'd never find out what they built together. Maren's jaw tightened. Her pulse hammered at the base of her throat, visible against the white column of her neck. If that's true, why tell me? What do you gain? Crane smiled. It was the emptiest expression she'd ever seen on a human face. Because Dominic Vasaro's only weakness is standing in front of me in a white dress. And I don't need to destroy him. I just need you to doubt him. He reached into his jacket and produced a thumb drive. Small, black. He set it on the ledge of a fire extinguisher case beside them, the way someone might leave a tip on a restaurant table. Everything's on there. Financials, communications, dates, names, including your father's. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Crane was gone before Maren turned her head, vanished through a service door like smoke pulled through a vent. She stood alone. The orchestra leaked through the walls, muffled and distant, like music heard from underwater. The thumb drive sat on the ledge. Maren stared at it. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came in short, ragged pulls that she couldn't regulate no matter how many ER breathing techniques she cycled through. She picked it up. She closed her fist around it and felt the plastic edges bite into her palm and thought about Dominic's hand on her waist and his unguarded stare and the painting he'd moved to catch the morning light and the contract clause he'd buried on page 31 and her father's voice cracking on the second syllable of her name and the 9 minutes she'd been allowed before the screen went black. Vasaro's network touches. Now she knew what it touched. It touched Elias Crane. It touched her father. It touched everything Dominic had sworn to protect her from, and the foundation of their entire arrangement, the rescue, the contract, the marriage, might have been built on a lie so vast it made the diamond on her finger feel like a shackle. She slipped the thumb drive into her pocket, straightened her spine, fixed her expression into the smooth, composed mask she'd perfected over weeks of performance. Then she walked back into the ballroom, found Dominic, and placed her hand on his arm with a smile so flawless that no one in the room, not the politicians, not the criminals, not the security teams watching from the shadows, could have guessed that she was carrying a bomb in her pocket. Not a weapon. Worse, evidence. And the moment she opened that drive, there would be no contract, no arrangement, no carefully negotiated terms that could contain what came next. She would know the truth about the man she was marrying, and the truth would either free her or bury her, and either way the woman who walked back to that ballroom would cease to exist. Maren Alcott stood beside Dominic Vasaro in a room full of monsters and smiled like a woman in love, and the thumb drive burned against her thigh like a lit fuse counting down to... The gala ended at midnight. The car ride home took 14 minutes. Maren counted every one of them by the rhythm of her own pulse against the thumb drive, hidden in the seam pocket of her gown, the plastic edges leaving a rectangular imprint on her thigh, like a brand she'd chosen to receive. Dominic sat beside her in silence. His hand rested on his knee, 2 inches from hers. He hadn't touched her since the ballroom. Something in the air between them had shifted. She felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm, not through logic, but through the animal brain, the part that knows danger before language can name it. He knew something was wrong. She was certain of it, not because he said anything, but because his silence had a different texture now. Watchful, calibrated. The silence of a man running calculations behind his eyes. He'd survived 32 years in a world that killed careless men by reading micro-expressions the way other people read street signs. And Maren, despite her weeks of performance, despite the mask she'd welded to her face in that service corridor, was carrying a secret heavy enough to bend her posture. She forced her shoulders back, kept her breathing shallow and even, looked out the window at the frozen city sliding past and thought about nothing except the glass and the snow and the road until the car descended into the underground garage beneath the penthouse tower. They rode the elevator in silence. 70 floors. The number on the display climbed, and Maren watched it the way a patient watches an IV drip, counting, measuring, waiting for the thing to run dry. The doors opened. Dominic stepped out first, stopped, turned. "You disappeared for 11 minutes at the gala." Not a question, a data point. Maren met his eyes. "I was in the restroom. The line was long. Rich women take forever." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. She held his for 4. Then he nodded, a single minimal dip of his chin, and walked toward his office without another word. Maren went to her room, closed the door, locked it, pressed her back against the wood, and stood there in the dark with her eyes closed and the thumb drive clutched in her fist until the shaking in her hand subsided enough to function. She changed out of the gown, hung it in the closet with the precision of someone disassembling a disguise. Put on hospital scrubs, her own, the ones she'd brought from her old apartment, soft and stained and smelling faintly of antiseptic. Her armor, her real skin. Then she sat cross-legged on the bathroom floor, the only room without cameras she'd confirmed during her second week by systematically checking every surface, corner, and ventilation grate, plugged the thumb drive into the burner tablet she'd purchased with cash from a pawn shop on West Madison during a hospital shift 3 days earlier, and opened the files. There were 412 documents, spreadsheets, bank records, wire transfer confirmations, scanned contracts with signatures she didn't recognize and signatures she did, communication logs, not emails, but encrypted message transcripts, stripped of metadata, organized chronologically. Maren read for 3 hours. By 4 a.m., her back ached, her eyes burned, and her entire understanding of the man sleeping 40 feet away had been gutted like a condemned building. Elias Crane had told the truth. Not all of it. She was experienced enough with liars to know that the most effective deceptions are built on 90% fact, but the core of it was real, documented, and damning. For nearly 4 years, Dominic Vasaro and Elias Crane had operated a joint financial network, shared shell corporations, coordinated shipping routes through the Great Lakes and into international waters, revenue splitting on operations that the documents referred to only by alphanumeric codes, XV-7, LC-12, Meridian, but whose financial scale made their nature unmistakable, and her father's name appeared 17 times, not as a victim, not as a whistleblower, as a contractor. Gordon Alcott had been hired, knowingly, willingly, for substantial compensation, to build the accounting architecture that made the Vasaro-Crane partnership invisible to federal investigators. He hadn't stumbled onto the files by accident. He'd created them. He was the architect of the very system he'd later tried to expose. And the reason he'd tried to expose it was not conscience, but leverage. A renegotiation that went wrong, a demand for a larger share that Dominic refused, and a threat to release everything that forced both men to turn on each other. Her father hadn't been kidnapped. He'd been contained. Dominic was keeping Gordon Alcott alive, not because he was protecting Maren's family, but because Gordon was the only living person who could reconstruct the financial trail well enough to testify. And dead men can't be controlled. Maren set the tablet on the bathroom tiles and pressed both palms flat against the cold floor. Her breathing had gone ragged. Not panic, something worse. A low seismic tremor running through her entire body as the architecture of her reality rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. Every conversation, every negotiated clause, every moment of carefully constructed trust. The painting moved to catch the light. The coffee brand he let her change, the unguarded stare across his glass desk. All of it refracted through a new lens and came back warped, poisoned, unrecognizable. She had married a man who was using her to keep her father compliant. Not a rescue, a hostage exchange, her freedom for her father's silence. And the worst part, the part that made her press her knuckles against her teeth to keep from making a sound, was that some of it had been real. She was sure of it. The way Dominic looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the way his voice changed when he said her name, the confession about his wrist. Those weren't performances. They couldn't be. She had spent her entire adult life reading pain on human faces, and Dominic Vasaro's pain was genuine. But genuine feeling and genuine honesty were not the same thing. A man could love you and lie to you in the same breath. A man could want you and use you simultaneously. And Dominic had built an entire marriage around the gap between those two truths, and she had walked into it with her eyes open and her heart exposed and her father's life in someone else's hands. Maren sat on the bathroom floor until the sky outside began to lighten. Then she wiped her face, dry. She hadn't cried. She refused to cry, hid the tablet in the false bottom of her medical bag, flushed the thumb drive down the toilet, and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. Dominic was already there. Of course he was. He stood at the counter in a gray t-shirt and black trousers, barefoot, pouring water into the French press with the unhurried precision he applied to everything. The scar on his wrist caught the early light. His hair was uncombed. He looked for one unguarded moment, like a normal man in a normal kitchen on a normal morning, and the domesticity of it hit Maren like a sucker punch. "You didn't sleep," he said without turning around. "I never sleep after events. Too much adrenaline. You should eat something." "I'm not hungry." He turned, looked at her. And whatever he saw in her face, she didn't know what it was, didn't know what expression she was wearing, didn't know if the 3 hours of reading had left marks visible to a man who read people the way she read lab results, made him set down the kettle and give her his full attention. What happened? The question was quiet, almost gentle. And the gentleness was the cruelest thing he could have offered, because it sounded like concern, and concern from Dominic Vasaro was a currency she could no longer trust. "Nothing happened. I'm tired." "Maren, don't say my name like that." "Like what?" "Like you own it." Silence. The kettle ticked as the metal cooled. Outside, a garbage truck ground through the pre-dawn street 70 stories below, the sound so faint it was almost imaginary. Dominic studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, and left the kitchen without another word. Maren wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat seeped into her palms. She stared at the steam curling upward and thought about the 17 times her father's name appeared in those documents and the careful architectural signatures beside wire transfers totaling more than she would earn in 3 lifetimes. She had 2 choices. Confront Dominic and watch the arrangement implode. Her father's safety, her own protection, the fragile equilibrium that kept everyone breathing, or bury what she knew and keep performing. She chose a third option. She would verify everything independently, outside of Dominic's surveillance apparatus, before making a single move. Because Elias Crane was a man who weaponized truth, and truth delivered by an enemy was still an enemy's weapon, and she would not be detonated on someone else's schedule. She needed to talk to her father, not through Dominic's monitored channels, not through the 9-minute window of a controlled video call. She needed to look Gordon Alcott in the eye and ask him directly whether he was a victim or a collaborator, and she needed his answer to be something she could trust, which meant she needed to find out where he was being kept. 3 days later, Maren began her counter-operation with the methodical patience of a woman who had spent years learning that survival was a procedural discipline. She started with Novak. Dominic's security chief was a creature of routine. Coffee at 5:30. Briefing preparation from 6 to 7. A phone call to someone, wife, girlfriend, handler, she didn't know. At 7:15 that lasted exactly 12 minutes. He kept a laptop in the security office adjacent to the kitchen, password protected but not encrypted, because Novak was analog by nature and treated digital security the way old mechanics treat electric cars, with grudging tolerance and minimal investment. Maren didn't need to hack the laptop. She needed one piece of information from it, the transport logs. Dominic's organization moved people the way it moved money, through layers. Safe houses, rotating drivers, coded designations. But Gordon Alcott required specialized containment. He was a high-value asset, not a disposable one. And specialized containment meant scheduled supply runs, medical check-ins, and communication windows that would leave traces in the logistics system. She waited until Novak's 7:15 phone call. Walked into the security office carrying 2 mugs of coffee. One for herself, one ostensibly for Novak. Set his mug on the desk beside the open laptop. Glanced at the screen for exactly 4 seconds while positioning the mug. 4 seconds was enough. The transport log was a spreadsheet, color-coded. She saw the designation Alcott G beside a location tag she didn't recognize, numerical, formatted like coordinates, and a scheduled medical check-in dated 5 days from now. She left the office, returned to her room, wrote the coordinates on the inside of her wrist with a surgical marker, the kind that washed off with alcohol but held firm against water and sweat. That evening, during her hospital shift, she entered the coordinates into a mapping application on the pawn shop tablet using the hospital's public Wi-Fi. The coordinates pointed to a property in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, 90 minutes north of Chicago, a private estate owned by a shell company called Meridian Holdings, LLC, Meridian. The same name from the financial files, one of the alphanumeric codes she'd found in the joint Vasaro-Crane transaction records. Maren stared at the map on the tablet screen. The estate sat on 20 acres of lakefront property, surrounded by forest, accessible by a single private road. Satellite imagery showed a main house, 2 auxiliary structures, and what appeared to be a guard station at the entrance gate. Her father was 90 minutes away. He'd been 90 minutes away the entire time, held in a property that bore the name of a criminal enterprise he'd helped build, guarded by men who worked for the man she'd married. She closed the tablet, slid it into her bag, finished her shift, rode home in the armored SUV without speaking, walked into the penthouse, nodded at the night security detail, went to her room, and sat on the bed in the dark. She was going to Lake Geneva. She was going to talk to her father, and whatever she learned would determine whether she burned Dominic Vasaro's empire to the ground or buried the truth so deep it never surfaced. The opportunity came 6 days later. Dominic was leaving for New York. A 2-day trip, meetings with financial partners, a dinner with a federal liaison, the kind of power maintenance that required his physical presence. He told Maren over breakfast, his tone clipped and businesslike, and she watched his jaw work as he chewed and thought about how easily a person could sit across from someone who dismantled their entire belief system and still notice the way light hit their cheekbone. "Novak will be here," Dominic said. 2 additional men on the lobby detail. Your hospital schedule doesn't change. Fine. If anything feels wrong, call Novak first, not me. He's faster. I know the protocol. Dominic paused, set his fork down, looked at her with that specific intensity that had become, over the weeks, both the thing she feared most and the thing she found hardest to look away from. You've been different since the gala. Her stomach clenched. Different how? Quieter. More careful. You're choosing your words in a way you didn't before. I'm tired, Dominic. This life is exhausting. I'm allowed to be tired. He held her gaze. She held his. The morning light between them was pale and unforgiving, and she could see every line in his face, every shade of dark in his irises, the faint shadow of fatigue beneath his eyes, that told her he hadn't been sleeping well either. If something is wrong, he said, I need you to tell me. There's nothing wrong. Maren, there's nothing wrong. He stood, buttoned his jacket, paused beside her chair and placed his hand, briefly, barely, on her shoulder. The weight of it passed through her collarbone and into her chest like an electrical charge. Then he was gone. The elevator doors closed. The penthouse settled into its particular brand of silence. Not empty, never empty, but quieter, as if the building itself exhaled when Dominic Vasaro left the premises. Maren waited 4 hours. At 2 p.m., she told the security detail she was going to her hospital shift. The driver took her to Mercy General. She entered through the main entrance, walked through the ER, exited through the staff parking lot on the opposite side of the building, and got into a rented sedan she'd paid for in cash through a colleague's name 3 days earlier. She drove north. The interstate was gray and flat and endless. Snow lined the shoulders like dirty lace. She drove at exactly the speed limit, hands at 10 and 2, her medical bag on the passenger seat containing the pawn shop tablet, a change of clothes, and a surgical kit. Not because she expected to perform surgery, but because the tools were familiar, and familiar tools made her hands stop shaking. Lake Geneva appeared after 87 minutes, a wealthy enclave of lakeside estates and winter-strip trees, the kind of place where money went to be quiet. She followed the map to the private road and turned off the engine half a mile from the estate gate. The walk took 11 minutes through frozen forest. Her breath came in white plumes that hung in the still air like small ghosts. The ground was hard beneath her boots, frozen solid, and every step sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The estate fence was 8 feet tall, wrought iron, with camera mounts at 40-foot intervals. She'd studied the satellite imagery enough to know the northwest corner was partially obscured by a mature oak. The camera angle couldn't cover the full base of the fence behind the trunk. She climbed. The iron was so cold it burned her palms through her gloves. She dropped to the other side and crouched in the snow, listening. Nothing. Wind. A bird somewhere. The distant mechanical hum of a generator. She moved through the tree line toward the main house. It was a sprawling stone structure, old money architecture, with a covered porch and dark windows. One of the auxiliary buildings, a converted carriage house, showed light. Warm yellow light, the kind that came from actual lamps, not the cold fluorescent of institutional confinement. The carriage house had a single guard, a man in a dark jacket standing beside the entrance, smoking, his breath and the cigarette smoke merging into one white column. He was facing the driveway. His back was to the tree line. Maren waited until he walked to the far end of the porch to flick his cigarette into the snow. Then she moved to the side door, unlocked, she confirmed with a slow turn of the handle, and slipped inside. A hallway, warm, wood-paneled, a kitchen to the left, clean and recently used. A coffee mug on the counter, a newspaper folded beside it. To the right, a living room. Comfortable furniture, books on shelves, a fireplace with dying embers. The specific decor of a prison designed to look like a home. Gordon Alcott sat in an armchair beside the fireplace, reading, glasses perched on his nose, a book open in his lap. He looked up when she entered, and the sequence of expressions that crossed his face, shock, terror, joy, and then something harder, something she couldn't name, played out in less than 2 seconds. Maren. He stood. The book hit the floor. How the hell did you... Sit down. Her voice was calm. Calm. The voice she used on combative patients and grieving families and trauma surgeons who'd lost their nerve. The voice that did not invite negotiation. Gordon sat. Maren remained standing. She didn't remove her coat. She positioned herself between her father and the door, not because she expected him to run, but because the geometry of the room needed to communicate something. That she was not here as his daughter. She was here as an interrogator. I found the files, she said. Gordon's face went absolutely still. Not surprise, not confusion. Stillness. The kind that comes from a man who has been waiting for a specific sentence and has finally heard it. Which files? Don't do that. Don't buy time. I read 412 documents over 3 hours. Bank records, wire transfers, communication logs. Your name appears 17 times. Not as a victim, as a contractor, as the architect of a joint financial network between Dominic Vasaro and Elias Crane. Gordon removed his reading glasses, folded them with precise, deliberate movements, set them on the armrest. Each gesture was slow, controlled, buying seconds the way a chess player burns the clock. Where did you get them? That doesn't matter. It matters a great deal, Maren. If Crane gave them to you, I said it doesn't matter. I'm asking you a direct question. Did you build the financial architecture for Dominic Vasaro's criminal network? Silence. The fire crackled. A log shifted and sent a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Yes. One word. No hedging, no softening. Maren felt it land in her chest like a fist. How long? 4 years. I was hired through a recruitment firm that specializes in, they call it financial restructuring, private clients, offshore work. I knew what it was. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I didn't. You laundered money. I built systems that moved money through channels designed to avoid detection. The legal distinction matters in a courtroom. It doesn't matter here. Yes, I laundered money. Maren's jaw was so tight she could feel her molars grinding. She forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the ER protocol applied to the wreckage of her own family. And Crane? You worked for both of them? I worked for the partnership. Vasaro handled the domestic side. Crane handled the international side. My job was to make the seams invisible. I was good at it. You were good at it. Maren, don't. Just don't. Keep going. You built the system. What happened? Gordon leaned forward. His hands hung between his knees, liver spotted, trembling slightly. Not from fear, she realized, but from something closer to exhaustion, The bone-deep weariness of a man who'd been carrying a lie so long it had calcified into his skeleton. The partnership fractured. Crane started running side operations, moving things through the network that weren't in the original agreement. I saw the transactions. I flagged them. Vasaro investigated. What Crane was moving it wasn't money anymore. It was people. The room contracted. Maren felt the walls press inward, not physically, but psychologically, the way a diagnosis changes the shape of a room the moment it's spoken. Trafficking. Yes. And Dominic? Dominic shut it down. Immediately. Violently. He killed 2 of Crane's logistics operators within 72 hours and froze every shared account. That's when the partnership ended. That's when the war started. But you kept working. No, I kept the files. There's a difference. I kept copies of everything. Crane's operations, Vasaro's operations, the joint accounts, the shell companies, all of it. Insurance. Insurance against who? Against both of them. Against whoever came for me first. Maren stared at her father. The fire threw shifting shadows across his face, aging him and unaging him in alternating flickers. And she saw him clearly for the first time. Not the father she remembered, not the victim she'd been told about, but the man he actually was. A man who'd sold his expertise to criminals, profited from it, kept records as leverage, and when the leverage failed, traded his daughter's freedom for his own survival. "You didn't disappear," she said. "You ran. I tried to renegotiate. The insurance, the files, they were supposed to be my leverage. I told Vasaro I wanted out. New identity, relocation, a severance package large enough to disappear. He refused. I threatened to release everything. He called my bluff. And then? And then Crane's people came for me. Not to kill me, to extract me. Crane wanted the files for himself. Vasaro got to me first. Moved me here. And yes, before you ask, the video calls, the 9-minute window, the monitored connection, all of it was designed to keep me cooperative, to keep me building what he needs for the next phase. What next phase? Gordon's eyes shifted. For the first time since she'd entered the room, he looked away from her, looked at the fire, at his hands, at the door behind her. He's restructuring the entire network. Going legitimate, or as legitimate as a man like Vasaro can go. But the transition requires moving billions through channels that don't exist yet. New shell companies, new banking relationships, new architecture, and the only person alive who understands the old architecture well enough to build the new one is me. So you're not a hostage, you're an employee. I'm both. That's how men like Vasaro operate. You're never just one thing to them. You're everything they need you to be, arranged in the configuration that benefits them most. The words hit Maren with the force of a clinical diagnosis she'd been avoiding, because that was exactly what she was to Dominic. Wife, shield, leverage, obsession, all layered on top of each other in a configuration designed to serve his interests. And the fact that his feelings were genuine didn't make the architecture less deliberate. "He told me he fell in love with me," she said. "The night of the wedding, he said he saw me outside the hospital in the rain and something changed." Gordon looked at her then. Really looked. And the expression on his face was the worst thing she'd ever seen. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition. The recognition of a man who understood exactly how Dominic Vasaro operated because he'd watched the machinery from the inside. "That might be true," Gordon said carefully. "Dominic is capable of genuine feeling. I've seen it, but with him, feeling and strategy are never separate. He doesn't fall in love and then figure out how to use it. He falls in love because part of his brain is already calculating the utility. It's not a choice. It's how he's built." Maren felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Crack. A hairline fracture running through the load-bearing wall of everything she'd allowed herself to feel over the past weeks. The late-night kitchen silence. The painting in the window. The hand on her shoulder that morning. All of it real. All of it weaponized. Both things simultaneously, inseparably, impossibly true. "I need to leave," she said. "You can't leave. If you run, Crane finds you. If Crane finds you, he uses you against Dominic. If he uses you against Dominic, everyone dies, including me." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Gordon stood, crossed the room, took her hands in his, the first time he'd touched her in 3 years, and his grip was cold and tight and desperate in a way that made her stomach lurch. You play the long game. You stay. You don't confront him. You let him believe the arrangement is working, and when the restructuring is complete and the old network is dismantled and Crane is dealt with, you take the files, the copies I've hidden, not the ones Crane gave you, and you use them to negotiate your own exit, properly. With leverage he can't refuse. You want me to stay married to a man who lied to me about everything. I want you to survive. That's what I've always wanted. No. What you've always wanted is to survive yourself. You built the system. You ran when it broke. You let your daughter get pulled into a contract marriage with a crime lord because it kept you alive and useful. Don't stand here and pretend this is about me. Gordon flinched. Actually flinched. A full-body contraction, as if she'd hit him. His hands dropped from hers. He took a step back. His mouth opened and opened again, and she watched him search for a response and come up empty. And the emptiness was the most honest thing he'd given her in years. You're right, he said. About all of it. I'm right too. Both things are true. I'm a selfish man who loves his daughter, and I used her, and I want her to survive, and all of those things exist inside me at the same time, and I don't know how to make any of them disappear. Maren looked at her father, this gray, diminished, shaking man standing in a gilded cage of his own making, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not anger. Clarity. She was surrounded by men who loved her and used her simultaneously, and the only person in this entire arrangement who had never lied to her was herself. And that meant the only person she could trust with her survival was the same woman who'd been surviving alone since she was 22 years old. She pulled her hands back, straightened her spine, tugged her coat tighter. Where are the copies, the real files? Not Crane's version. Gordon hesitated. Maren, where? There's a safety deposit box. First National, downtown Chicago. Box 1847. The key is hidden in my old apartment, if they haven't cleared it. Inside the baseboard heater in the bedroom, taped to the underside of the grate. She memorized the details, said nothing, turned toward the door. Maren, please. She stopped, didn't turn. Be careful with Dominic. He's not like Crane. Crane will destroy you because it's useful. Dominic will destroy you because he can't help it. He'll hold you so tight he'll crush you, and he won't even realize he's doing it until you stop breathing. She walked out of the carriage house into the frozen night air. The guard was on the far side of the porch, lighting another cigarette, his back still turned. She crossed the tree line, climbed the fence, and walked through the dark forest to the rental car with her father's voice echoing in her skull like a diagnosis she couldn't unhear. The drive back to Chicago took 91 minutes. She returned the rental to the hospital parking lot, entered through the staff entrance, changed into fresh scrubs, and walked into the ER as if she'd been there all evening. The charge nurse glanced at her and said nothing. The clock read 11:47 p.m. The armored SUV picked her up at midnight. The driver said nothing. The penthouse was dark when she arrived. Dominic was still in New York. Novak nodded to her from his station by the elevator, and she nodded back and went to her room and locked the door and sat on the bed in the dark. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dominic. 2 words. Everything okay? She typed back with steady fingers. Everything's fine. Good night. She set the phone face down on the nightstand, stared at the ceiling, counted her breaths the way she counted them in the OR when a patient was coding and every second cost blood. She was not going to run. She was not going to confront. She was going to get the key from her father's apartment, open the safety deposit box, obtain the real files, the complete record of every crime, every transaction, every name. And then she was going to do something that neither Dominic Vasaro nor Elias Crane nor her own father had anticipated. She was going to use the files not as leverage, not as insurance, not as a weapon in someone else's war. She was going to give them to someone outside the game entirely. She hadn't decided who yet. FBI, a federal prosecutor, a journalist with enough reach to make the story unkillable. The specifics didn't matter yet. What mattered was the principle, that the only way to escape a machine built on leverage was to remove the leverage from every hand that held it, including her own. It was the most dangerous decision she'd ever made. It would destroy Dominic's empire, expose her father, terminate the arrangement, eliminate her protection, put her name in federal databases and courtroom transcripts and headline crawls for years. But it would also do something none of these men had ever offered her. It would make her free. Not Dominic's version of freedom, The unlocked door that was still inside his building. Not her father's version. The negotiated exit that kept the system intact. Real freedom. The kind that doesn't come with clauses or conditions or someone else's signature at the bottom. Maren lay in the dark and felt the weight of the decision settle over her like a second skin, heavier than the gown she'd worn to the gala, heavier than the ring on her finger, heavier than every lie she'd told and been told in the past 6 weeks. Tomorrow, Dominic would return from New York. Tomorrow she would kiss him hello and pour his coffee and sit across from him at breakfast and perform the role of a woman who trusted him, while carrying the blueprints of his destruction in her medical bag. And the day after that, she would go to her father's old apartment on the south side and retrieve a key that would unlock everything. She closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come. She hadn't expected it to. Outside, the snow kept falling over Chicago. Indifferent, relentless, burying everything beneath a clean white surface that made the city look, for a few hours, like a place where nothing terrible had ever happened. Maren knew better. She knew the snow would melt, the dirt would show. And when it did, the woman lying in this bed would no longer be the woman Dominic Vasaro married, or the woman Maren Alcott sacrificed, or the woman Elias Crane tried to weaponize. She would be something none of them had prepared for. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything left to choose, standing at the exact center of a war between 3 men who each believed they controlled her, holding the match that could burn all of them, and herself, to the ground. The only question left was when she'd strike it. And as the first gray light of a Chicago dawn crept through the penthouse windows, Maren Alcott opened her eyes, placed both feet on the cold marble floor, and stood. She didn't shower, didn't eat. She pulled on jeans, a black thermal, her old hospital parka, the one with the broken zipper she'd had since residency, and shoved the pawn shop tablet into her medical bag along with a box cutter, a flashlight, and $40 in cash. The ring stayed on her finger. Removing it would trigger questions she wasn't ready to answer. Novak was in the kitchen, coffee, shoulder holster, the eternal sentinel. "I'm going to my old apartment," Maren said. "I left some things there, personal items." Novak looked at her over the rim of his mug. "I'll send a driver." "I don't need a driver. I need an hour alone in the place I used to live. Is that something this arrangement allows, or do I need to file a request?" The sarcasm landed. Novak's jaw tightened. He set the mug down with a deliberate click. "Take the sedan. Yuri drives. He'll wait outside. Non-negotiable." Maren didn't argue. A driver outside was manageable. A driver inside the apartment was not. The sedan pulled up to her old building on South Halsted at 8:17 a.m. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Graffiti on the bodega shutters, a broken streetlight that had been broken since she moved in, the same cluster of pigeons on the fire escape like permanent tenants nobody could evict. The building's front door still didn't lock properly. The hallway still smelled like cooking oil and mildew, and the particular staleness of a place where people survived rather than lived. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. The landlord hadn't re-rented it yet. Probably couldn't, given the state of the plumbing and the radiator that worked on alternate Thursdays. Maren used the key she'd never returned, opened the door, and stepped into the small, cold space that used to be her life. It was exactly as she'd left it. Dishes in the rack, a dead plant on the windowsill, textbooks stacked beside the couch. The walls were bare except for a single watercolor she'd painted in college. A rain-streaked Chicago street scene. Amateur but honest. The kind of art that embarrassed her now because it was proof she'd once had time to make something beautiful. She went straight to the bedroom. The baseboard heater sat beneath the window, a rust-streaked metal unit that hadn't functioned properly in 2 years. She knelt, pulled the box cutter from her bag, worked the blade beneath the grate, and pried it loose with a slow, grinding screech of metal on metal. Dust, cobwebs, dead insects, and taped to the underside of the grate with brown packing tape, a small brass key. Maren peeled it free, held it between her thumb and forefinger. It was warm from her hand, light as a bullet casing, and it represented the complete financial record of every crime Dominic Vasaro and Elias Crane had committed over 4 years. She slid it into the inside pocket of her parka, replaced the grate, stood, wiped her hands on her jeans. Her phone buzzed. Dominic, calling, not texting. She stared at the screen for 2 rings, then answered. "Morning. I land in 40 minutes. Where are you?" "My old apartment, picking up some things." A pause. Barely perceptible, but she caught it. The micro-hesitation of a man recalculating. I didn't know you still had access. I kept the key. Is that a problem? No. I'll see you at home. Home. He said it casually, as if the penthouse was something they shared rather than something he owned and she occupied. The word landed in her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. See you then, she said, and hung up. She spent 20 minutes collecting things she didn't need. Old photographs, a wool scarf, a coffee mug from a hospital Christmas party, props for the cover story. Carried them downstairs in a paper bag. Got into the sedan. Yuri, the driver, didn't ask a single question. On the ride back to the penthouse, Maren pressed her hand against the key through her parka and thought about the First National Bank on LaSalle Street and the safety deposit box numbered 1847 and the contents that would, once she held them, make her the most dangerous person in Chicago. More dangerous than Dominic. More dangerous than Crane, because she was the only person in this war who had nothing to protect except herself. She went to the bank the next morning during her hospital shift. The same method as Lake Geneva. Entered Mercy General through the main entrance, exited through the staff lot, took a cab to LaSalle Street, walked into First National wearing scrubs beneath her parka, the brass key in her fist. The vault clerk was a young man with a thin mustache, and the bored expression of someone who spent 8 hours a day watching people open boxes full of secrets he'd never know. He verified the box number, checked the key, led her to a private viewing room. Box 1847 was small, 6 inches by 12. Inside it, a single external hard drive, matte black, the size of a deck of cards. No labels, no markings, just the drive and a folded piece of paper. Maren unfolded the paper. Her father's handwriting, cramped, precise, the penmanship of an accountant trained in an era before everything went digital. 3 lines. Everything is here. Originals, not copies. If you're reading this, I'm either dead or I failed. I'm sorry for both. She stared at the note for a long time. Then she folded it, put it in her pocket, placed the hard drive in her medical bag, closed the box, and walked out of the bank into the gray Chicago morning. She had the files, the real files, the originals. Now she needed a recipient. She'd spent 3 days considering her options. FBI meant bureaucracy, delays, potential leaks from agents already on Dominic's payroll. And she knew he had them. She'd seen the names in the gala guest list, the federal prosecutor who toasted their engagement, the comfortable ease with which Dominic moved through institutional power. A federal route meant trusting a system already compromised. A journalist was faster, more public, harder to suppress. But a journalist meant exposure. Her name, her face, her father's role, every detail of the arrangement published and dissected and immortalized in print. She would become a story, a character, a footnote in someone else's narrative. Neither option was clean. Both involved destruction. She chose the journalist, though not out of principle, out of speed, because something in Dominic's voice during that phone call, the pause, the recalculation when she mentioned her old apartment, told her the window was closing. He was too smart, too attuned to the frequencies of deception. Sooner or later, he would find the missing piece, the 11 minutes at the gala, the trip to Lake Geneva, the key beneath the baseboard, and when he did, the door would lock forever. She needed to move, now. There was a reporter at the Tribune, Helen Kazarian, investigative unit, known for financial crime exposés, 2 Pulitzer nominations, a reputation for protecting sources the way Dominic protected his assets. Absolutely. Maren had read her work during long hospital nights, the kind of meticulous, unflinching journalism that treated evidence like surgical instruments and deployed them with precision. Maren called from a payphone outside the hospital. A payphone. She'd had to walk 6 blocks to find one that still worked, a relic bolted to the wall of a laundromat on Archer Avenue, the receiver sticky with something she chose not to identify. 3 rings. Voicemail. A voice. Clipped. Professional. No nonsense. Kazarian. Leave it. My name doesn't matter. I have the complete financial records of a criminal organization operating in Chicago. Originals. 4 years of transactions, shell companies, bank records, and names, including public officials. I want to meet. Tomorrow. Neutral location. I'll call back at this time with the details. She hung up, wiped the receiver with her sleeve, walked back to the hospital with her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Mog. Dominic was home when she returned that evening. She knew it before the elevator doors opened. Something in the air, a density, a gravitational shift that announced his presence the way a change in temperature announces a weather front. He was standing in the living room beside the panoramic windows, silhouetted against the Chicago skyline, holding a glass of whiskey and looking at the watercolor she'd left on the kitchen counter weeks ago. The one he'd moved to catch the morning light. He'd moved it again. Back to the counter, facing the wall. The gesture was so small, so deliberate, that it took Maren a full 3 seconds to understand its meaning. He'd repositioned her painting, turned it away from the light. A message encoded in the language of objects, the way Dominic communicated everything that mattered. Not through words, but through arrangements of power and space. Something had changed. "How was New York?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She set her bag on the kitchen island, carefully, casually, the hard drive inside cushioned by scrubs and gauze pads. "Productive." He didn't turn from the window. "How was the apartment?" "Dusty, depressing, made me grateful for the marble floors." "And the hospital?" "Same as always, 12-hour shift. 2 GSWs, a cardiac arrest, a kid who swallowed a battery. Tuesday." Now he turned. The whiskey caught the light as he rotated, amber and gold, and his eyes found hers with the precision of a targeting system locking onto coordinates. "Novak tells me you left the hospital during your shift." The air left the room. Not literally. The ventilation hummed. The penthouse breathed its mechanical breath. But Maren felt the oxygen thin, felt the space between them compress into something dense and airless. "I went to get coffee. The hospital cafeteria machine was broken." "For 47 minutes. There was a line." "At what coffee shop?" Maren held his gaze. Her pulse was a war drum in her ears, but her face was marble. She was sure of it. She willed it. She constructed it the way she constructed calm in the OR when a patient was dying and every person in the room was looking at her for instructions. "I don't remember the name. It was on Harrison. Small place. Why?" Dominic took a slow sip of whiskey, set the glass on the windowsill, walked toward her. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who understood that the most effective pressure was applied gradually. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, the cedar of his cologne, the undertone of cold air that clung to his coat as if he'd been outside recently. His eyes moved across her face the way a radiologist reads a scan, systematically, looking for anomalies. "Maren, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to understand that the answer matters more than you think. Ask. Is there something you're not telling me?" The question hung between them like a wire pulled taut. One wrong vibration, and it would snap. Maren looked at him. This man who had terrified a city, who had held her father hostage and called it protection, who had moved her painting to catch the morning light and then turned it to face the wall, and made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a detonation. "No," she said, "there's nothing." Dominic searched her face for 4 seconds. She counted them. Each one felt like a year. Then he nodded, stepped back, picked up his whiskey. "Good," he said. "Because I need you tomorrow night. There's a dinner. Private, 8 guests. It's important." "I'll be there." He walked past her toward his office, paused in the doorway, didn't turn around. "The painting looks better facing the window," he said. "I moved it back." He disappeared into the office. The door closed. Maren stood alone in the kitchen, both hands flat on the marble island, breathing through her nose in controlled bursts. Her medical bag sat 18 inches from her left hand, the hard drive inside it containing enough evidence to put Dominic Vasaro in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know what. But the clock in his head was running, and it was faster than hers. She needed to meet Kazarian. Tomorrow. Before the dinner. Before Dominic's suspicion crystallized into certainty, and the walls of this glass cage closed for the final time. The call to Kazarian went out at 7:03 a.m. from the same laundromat payphone. This time, the journalist answered on the second ring. "I got your message. I'm listening. Grant Park, the Buckingham Fountain Pavilion, East Side, tomorrow at noon. I'll be wearing a gray coat. I'll have a hard drive with me. You'll have 30 minutes. I need more than 30 minutes for what you're describing. 30 minutes is what I have. Bring a laptop with an air-gapped partition. Don't bring a photographer. Don't bring a recorder. If I see anyone with you, I walk." A pause. Kazarian's breathing on the line, steady, evaluative, the breathing of a woman who weighed risks for a living. "I'll be there." Maren hung up, walked back to the hospital, worked a 10-hour shift during which she intubated a stroke patient, debrided a burn wound, and held a 17-year-old girl's hand while telling her that her brother didn't survive the car accident. By the time she got home, her hands smelled like latex and antiseptic and the particular metallic tang of someone else's grief. Dominic was in his office. The door was closed. She heard his voice through the wall, low, rapid, the cadence of a man issuing instructions he expected to be followed without question. She went to her room, set the alarm for 6 a.m., lay down with her clothes on. Sleep came in fragments. She dreamed of her father's handwriting on the folded note. She dreamed of the painting turned toward the wall. She dreamed of Dominic's hand on her shoulder, brief, barely, and woke with the phantom weight of it still pressing against her collarbone. Halt. The next day unraveled before it began. Maren's alarm went off at 6. She dressed, showered, pulled the hard drive from her medical bag, and transferred it to the inside pocket of her gray coat, the one she'd told Kazarian she'd be wearing. She checked the pocket 3 times, checked the zipper, checked the lining for holes. At 7:15, she walked into the kitchen. Novak was there. 2 men she'd never seen before flanked him, younger, harder, with the particular stillness of professionals trained in close protection. They weren't Dominic's regular detail. They were new. Novak looked at her. His expression was the same flat mask it always was, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A tightening, a readiness, the look of a dog that had been told to sit but wanted to run. "Change of plans today," Novak said. "You're staying in." "Excuse me?" "Threat assessment. Crane's people were spotted near the hospital yesterday. Until we clear the perimeter, you don't leave the building." Maren felt the floor tilt beneath her. Not physically. The marble was solid, unyielding, expensive, but the room reorganized itself around a new reality. The 2 new guards, the locked-down schedule, the timing. "I have a shift." "Canceled. Hospital's been notified." "You can't cancel my shifts without—" "It's done. Take it up with him." Novak jerked his chin toward the hallway. Dominic's office. Maren walked. Each step on the marble sounded like a countdown. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Dominic sat behind his glass desk. Screens glowed along the far wall. Security feeds, financial dashboards. The architecture of his empire rendered in pixels and real-time data. He was in shirt sleeves. The scar on his wrist was visible. He looked up when she entered, and his expression, controlled, assessing, not unkind, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about Crane. This was about her. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." "Sit down, Maren." She sat. The chair was leather, cold, positioned lower than his, an interrogation geometry she recognized from every cop drama she'd ever watched and every ER confrontation she'd ever mediated. Dominic folded his hands on the desk. His knuckles were bruised. She hadn't noticed that before. Fresh bruises, purple-black, the kind that came from hitting something or someone very hard within the last 12 hours. "3 days ago," he said, "a rental car registered under the name of one of your colleagues was returned to the Mercy General staff lot at 11:42 p.m. The mileage log shows a round trip of approximately 180 miles. The GPS record was wiped, but the toll transponder wasn't. It pinged northbound on I-94 at 6:23 p.m. and southbound at 10:17 p.m. Each sentence landed like a surgical incision, precise, bloodless, designed to expose what was underneath. "Lake Geneva is 87 miles from Chicago," Dominic continued. "A round trip would produce approximately 174 miles. The additional 6 miles are consistent with local navigation from the highway to a residential property." Maren said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was laid out with the clinical thoroughness of a medical chart, each data point building toward a diagnosis she couldn't refute. "You visited your father," Dominic said, "without authorization, without security, without telling anyone." "He's my father. He's a high-value asset in an active threat environment. Your unprotected visit compromised the security of his location, his containment protocols, and your own safety." "His containment protocols. Listen to yourself." "I'm listening to myself very carefully. I need you to do the same." Dominic leaned forward, the bruised knuckles pressed against the glass desktop. "What did he tell you?" "That he misses me, that he's scared, that he wants to come home." "What else?" "Nothing else." "Maren, nothing else." Dominic stared at her. The office was silent except for the low hum of electronics and the distant moan of wind against the building's exterior. 70 stories of glass and steel, and someone else's empire pressing down on her like a physical weight. "I know about the files," he said. The words hit her like a defibrillator shock. Her hands gripped the armrests of the chair, and her vision narrowed, and her breathing stopped for one full second before she forced it to restart. "Crane gave you a drive at the gala. Service corridor, east wing. You were gone for 11 minutes. My security team found the camera blind spot he used. They found his fingerprints on the fire extinguisher case. So he didn't know about the bank. He didn't know about the originals. He knew about Crane's copy, the thumb drive she'd already flushed. "I destroyed it," she said. "The drive, I didn't open it." "You're lying. I flushed it down the toilet the night of the gala. I didn't trust anything Crane gave me. Why would I?" Dominic studied her. His eyes moved across her face with the intensity of a man reading a language he wasn't sure he understood anymore. She could see the war happening behind his expression, the instinct to believe her fighting the instinct that had kept him alive for 32 years. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid of what you'd do." That answer was true. Not complete, but true. And she delivered it with the specific vulnerability she'd learned to deploy in the ER. The slight break in the voice, the softening of the eyes, the momentary lowering of defenses that made the other person feel like they were being trusted even when they were being managed. Dominic exhaled, a long, controlled breath that fogged slightly in the air-conditioned chill of the office. He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. "Crane is trying to turn you against me. That's his strategy. He can't beat me militarily, so he's attacking the one thing He stopped, opened his eyes, looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not the calculated composure, not the predatory stillness, but something raw and unfinished and dangerous, like a wound exposed to air for the first time. "The one thing I can't afford to lose." Maren felt the hairline fracture in her chest widen, because he meant it. She could see it in the way his hands trembled slightly against the desk, in the bruised knuckles that told her he'd spent the previous night hitting something because he couldn't hit the thing that was actually hurting him, in the particular agony of a man who had built his entire existence around control and was now staring at the one variable he couldn't control. He was in love with her. Genuinely, destructively, catastrophically in love with her. And his love was indistinguishable from his need for control, and his control was indistinguishable from his violence. And somewhere inside the machinery of Dominic Vasaro, there was a human being screaming to get out, and Maren could hear him. And hearing him was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her, because it made her want to stay. "The dinner tonight," Dominic said, his voice steadier now, the composure rebuilding itself in real time like a wall being reconstructed brick by brick. 8 guests, 3 of them are federal contacts I need for the restructuring. 2 are financial partners. The other 3 are Crane's former associates who are considering switching sides. If this dinner goes well, Crane loses his remaining support network. If it doesn't, the war escalates into something none of us survive. And you need me there. I need you beside me, the way you've been beside me every night for the past 6 weeks. I need them to see a man with something worth protecting. That's the message. That's the strategy. I'm the strategy. You're the woman He stopped again. His jaw tightened so hard she could see the muscle flex beneath the skin. You're the reason the strategy works, because they look at you and they see something real. And it is real. Whatever you believe about me, whatever Crane told you, that part is real. Maren sat in the interrogation chair, the hard drive in her coat pocket hanging on a hook 3 rooms away, the journalist waiting for her in Grant Park in 4 hours, and looked at the man who had lied to her and loved her and imprisoned her father and moved her painting to catch the light, and felt the full, unbearable weight of a truth she could no longer avoid. She believed him, not about everything, not about the arrangement or the contract or the carefully engineered circumstances that brought her here, but about the feeling itself, the raw, uncontrollable, terrifying thing living behind his eyes. She believed him completely, and that belief was going to make what came next so much worse. "I'll be at the dinner," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just tell me what to wear." She stood, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. "Dominic." "Yes." "If I find out you're lying to me about any of it, I won't run. I won't negotiate. I'll burn every piece of it to the ground. Do you understand?" He looked at her across the glass desk, across the architecture of his empire, across the wreckage of every barrier that had ever existed between them, and she watched his expression shift one final time, from composure to recognition to something that looked impossibly like respect. "I understand," he said. She left the office and closed the door and leaned against the hallway wall and pressed both fists against her eyes until the trembling stopped. The Grant Park meeting was impossible now. The lockdown was real. The new guards were positioned at every exit. Novak's surveillance had been tripled. She couldn't reach Kazarian, couldn't leave the building, couldn't make a call without it being logged, traced, and analyzed. She was trapped inside the glass cage, holding a bomb she couldn't deliver. But the dinner. 8 guests. 3 of them Crane's former associates. If Crane knew about this dinner, and he did, because Crane knew everything, because that was his entire methodology, he wouldn't let it happen. The dinner represented the collapse of his remaining support network. He would act. He would move. Tonight. Maren stood in the hallway and felt the terrible clarity of a woman who had run out of options and was left with nothing but instinct. She couldn't get the files to Kazarian. She couldn't leave the building. She couldn't trust Dominic. She couldn't trust her father. She couldn't trust Crane. The only move left was the one none of them expected. Not escape, not betrayal, not compliance, but presence. Being in the room when the collision happened. Being awake and armed and ready when Crane made his move, because he would make his move tonight, at this dinner, in this penthouse, and when the glass finally shattered, she needed to be standing in the exact right place to survive the blast. She went to her room, opened the closet, chose a black dress, not silk, not structured, something she could move in, something that wouldn't restrict her arms or tangle around her legs. She pulled her hair back, applied minimal makeup, slid the hard drive from her coat pocket into a clutch bag small enough to carry but large enough to hold what mattered. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the night to begin. Gushaites. The guests arrived at 8 p.m. Maren stood beside Dominic in the penthouse foyer and shook hands and smiled and memorized every face. The federal contacts were polished, cautious, performatively relaxed. The financial partners were older, European accented, with the quiet confidence of men whose wealth had survived multiple economic collapses. Crane's former associates were different, younger, sharper, with the restless energy of people who had recently changed allegiance and hadn't yet committed to the new direction. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, 12-foot ceilings, a single long table, candles instead of overhead lighting. Dominic's choice, she assumed, because candlelight made people feel intimate and intimacy made people careless. The conversation was elegant, coded, dangerous. Business discussed in metaphor. Threats delivered as anecdotes. Promises implied through the careful calibration of eye contact and the strategic deployment of silence. Maren ate and drank and performed and watched and felt the specific tension of a room full of predators pretending to be civilized. At 9:47 p.m., she excused herself to the restroom. She didn't go to the restroom. She went to the kitchen, stood beside the service entrance, pressed her ear against the door that led to the staff corridor. Voices. Low. Not Novak's. Not anyone she recognized. She opened the door 3 inches. 2 men in the corridor, black tactical clothing, earpieces, sidearms visible against their thighs. They were not Dominic's security. She knew Dominic's security, their faces, their builds, their postures, with the intimate familiarity of a woman who had been surrounded by them for 6 weeks. These men were new. These men were wrong. Maren closed the door silently. Her pulse slammed against her throat. Her hands were steady. The ER reflex, the crisis protocol, the part of her brain that had been trained to function when everything was failing. She walked back to the dining room, sat down beside Dominic, placed her hand on his thigh beneath the table. He stiffened. She never touched him first. That was the rule, the unspoken boundary she'd maintained since the first night. Her initiating physical contact was a deviation so significant it functioned as an alarm. She leaned close. Her lips brushed his ear. To the guests, it looked like intimacy. To Dominic, it was a field report. 2 men in the service corridor, tactical gear, not yours. She felt his thigh turn to stone beneath her palm. His breathing didn't change. His expression didn't shift. But his right hand moved, slowly, casually, naturally, beneath his jacket to the holster she'd always known was there, but had never seen him reach for. He turned his head. His lips touched her ear. When I stand up, you walk to the bedroom. The panel behind the headboard. Push the upper left corner. It opens inward. Go inside. Don't come out. No. Maren, I'm not hiding in the walls while they kill you. You're not. I watched you get beaten last time from behind a ventilation grate. I'm not doing it again from behind a headboard. Tell me the plan or I make my own. His eyes locked onto hers, 2 inches apart. She could see every shade of dark in his irises, the network of blood vessels in the whites, the specific expression of a man confronting something he hadn't prepared for. Not fear, not anger, but the overwhelming realization that the woman he'd tried to cage had become the one variable he couldn't control and didn't want to. The emergency ventilation system, she whispered. The sleeping gas. Where's the trigger? Generator room. Behind the kitchen service wall. Red panel. Code is 7714. How long to take effect? 90 seconds. I can get there. They're in the service corridor, but the generator room access is through the pantry. They won't see me if I go now. Maren, if they catch you... Dominic! She gripped his thigh hard enough that her nails bit through the fabric. You need 90 seconds. I can give you 90 seconds, but I need you to keep everyone at this table until the gas hits. Can you do that? He looked at her as though the world itself had narrowed to her existence. The same expression from the wedding, the same terrifying sincerity, but layered over it now was something new. Not the desire to protect her, but the recognition that she didn't need protecting, that she was, in this moment, the most capable person in the room. Go, he said. She stood from the table, smiled at the guests, excused herself with the practiced grace of a woman who had been performing for 6 weeks and was now, for the first time, performing with purpose. She walked into the kitchen. Her heels clicked against the tile. She slipped them off, left them beside the refrigerator, 2 black shoes standing neatly side by side like sentinels guarding nothing, and moved barefoot across the cold floor toward the pantry door. The pantry was narrow, dark, lined with shelves of supplies that Dominic's kitchen staff kept immaculately organized. At the far end, a maintenance door. She opened it. A short corridor. The generator room. Red panel on the wall. Numeric keypad. Her fingers hovered. 7, 7, 1, 4. The panel beeped. A low hum began, barely audible, felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled through the floor and up through her bare feet into her bones. The ventilation system shifted. Somewhere in the ceiling, vents opened and the gas began its silent migration through the penthouse ductwork. 90 seconds, she counted. Mississippi 1. Mississippi 2. At Mississippi 19, she heard shouting from the main corridor, the service door slamming open, heavy boots on marble. The dinner was over. Crane's men were moving. At Mississippi 31, gunfire. 3 shots, close together. The distinctive flat crack of a handgun discharged indoors, followed by the heavier report of a tactical weapon, a sound she knew from the ER, from the bodies that arrived with entry wounds the size of quarters and exit wounds the size of fists. At Mississippi 44, someone screamed, not Dominic, one of the guests. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of furniture breaking, glass shattering, the percussive chaos of violence erupting in an enclosed space. At Mississippi 60, the shouting changed pitch, confusion entering the voices, slurred consonants. The gas was reaching the common areas. At Mississippi 73, the generator room door opened behind her. Maren spun. A man stood in the doorway. Tactical vest. Rebreather mask pulled over his nose and mouth. Eyes visible above the mask. Cold, operational, scanning the room until they found her. He raised his weapon. Maren grabbed the only object within reach, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall beside the generator panel, and swung it with both hands in a horizontal arc that connected with the man's forearm. The impact was enormous. She felt it travel up through her wrists, through her elbows, into her shoulders, and the weapon discharged into the ceiling as his grip failed. Tile fragments rained down. The man staggered. Maren swung again, lower, harder, aiming for the knee, and felt cartilage give way beneath the metal cylinder with a sound like a branch snapping. He went down. She dropped the extinguisher, seized his fallen weapon, a compact submachine gun, heavier than she expected, warm from his hands, and backed toward the corridor door. Her fingers were shaking, her breath came in ragged pulls, but her eyes were clear and her mind was functioning with the terrible lucidity of a woman who had crossed a line she couldn't uncross and was now operating on the other side of it, in a country with no maps and no roads back. She moved through the corridor toward the main penthouse. The gas was thick now. She could feel it in her sinuses, a faint chemical sweetness that prickled at the edges of consciousness. She pulled her shirt up over her nose and mouth. Not a rebreather, not enough. But the generator room had been sealed from the main system. She'd had cleaner air than anyone in the penthouse for the last 90 seconds, which gave her a narrow window before the exposure caught up. The main living area was chaos. 3 of Crane's men were on the floor, unconscious or close to it, their rebreathers insufficient against the concentration Maren had triggered at full output. 2 more were still standing, masks secured, moving through the gas-hazed room toward Dominic's position behind an overturned dining table. The guests were scattered, some on the floor, some against the walls, the federal contacts huddled behind a marble column with the specific terror of people who had never been in the same room as live gunfire. Dominic was behind the table, bleeding. His left arm hung at an angle that told Maren, with the clinical certainty of a trauma nurse, that the shoulder was dislocated or worse. His right hand held a pistol. His face was streaked with blood from a cut above his eyebrow, and his breathing was audible, labored, the breathing of a man running on adrenaline and stubbornness and nothing else. He saw her emerge from the corridor. His eyes widened, his mouth opened. She didn't give him time to speak. She raised the weapon, braced it against her shoulder the way she'd seen Novak's men hold theirs during morning drills she'd watched from the penthouse windows, and fired 3 rounds into the ceiling above the 2 remaining operatives. The sound was annihilating. Her ears screamed. The recoil slammed into her collarbone like a fist. Plaster and concrete rained down. The operatives ducked. Reflexive, automatic, exactly what she needed, and in that half second of distraction, Dominic moved. He came over the table like something unleashed. The pistol barked twice. 1 operative dropped. The second turned, weapon rising, and Dominic closed the distance in 2 strides and hit him with a forearm strike to the throat that dropped him to his knees, followed by a knee to the face that ended the fight with a sound like a melon striking concrete. Silence. Not real silence. The ringing in Maren's ears was so loud it felt like a second pulse, but the absence of gunfire, the absence of screaming, the sudden vacuum that follows violence the way stillness follows a thunderclap. Dominic stood in the center of his ruined dining room, breathing hard, bleeding, his dislocated arm pressed against his side, surrounded by unconscious bodies and shattered glass and the dissipating chemical haze of the ventilation system. He looked at Maren. She stood barefoot in the doorway, holding a weapon she'd taken from a man she'd kneecapped with a fire extinguisher, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hair falling from its pins, her hands shaking so violently the gun rattled against the metal of its own receiver. And then the front entrance of the penthouse exploded inward. The reinforced door blew off its hinges. Concussive force knocked Maren sideways into the wall. Her skull hit marble. Stars. White light. The weapon fell from her hands and skittered across the floor. Through the ringing and the dust and the chemical haze, she saw him. Elias Crane walked through the destroyed entrance, flanked by 4 men in full tactical gear, rebreathers secured, weapons raised. He moved with the unhurried calm of a man who had planned for every contingency. including this one. His suit was immaculate. His expression was the empty, calculating mask she remembered from the service corridor at the gala. He looked at the destroyed room, at the unconscious bodies, at Dominic, bleeding and cornered, at Maren, on the floor against the wall, unarmed, dazed, her ears ringing and her vision swimming. Crane smiled, the emptiest expression she had ever seen on a human face. "I told you," he said to Dominic. "She's your weakness." He turned to his men, pointed at Maren. "Take her." Dominic lunged. One of Crane's operatives hit him across the face with the stock of a rifle. He went down, got up, got hit again, got up again. Blood poured from his mouth. His dislocated arm dragged uselessly at his side. He got up a third time, and a third man drove a boot into his ribs that bent him double and sent him to the marble with a sound that Maren felt in her own body like a shared wound. Two men seized her arms, hauled her upright. Her bare feet slipped on blood-slicked marble. The clutch bag, the one containing the hard drive, the original files, the complete record of everything, was on the floor 6 feet away, contents spilling across the wreckage. Crane picked up the hard drive, turned it over in his hands. His eyebrows rose. "Well," he said softly, "what do we have here?" He looked at Maren, then at Dominic, on his knees, bleeding, held in place by two men with rifles pressed against the back of his skull. "It seems your wife has been busy, Dominic." Crane pocketed the hard drive, straightened his cuffs, looked at his watch. "Here's what happens now. You give me the access codes to every offshore account, every political file, every piece of leverage you've accumulated over the past decade. You do this before sunrise. If you refuse, I don't kill her. That would be too quick. I send her father's files, the ones she so helpfully collected for me, to every federal agency, every news outlet, and every enemy you've ever made. Your empire collapses. Your name becomes synonymous with every crime in those documents. And your wife, your real, genuine, foolishly brave wife, becomes a federal witness who will spend the rest of her life in protection programs and courtrooms." He leaned down until his face was level with Dominic's. "Or you give me what I want," and she walks away, clean, free, untouched. Dominic looked up through the blood and the swelling and the ruins of his composure. His eyes found Maren across the room, held by two men, barefoot, bleeding from a cut on her temple, her dress torn, her hands zip-tied in front of her. She looked back at him, and in that look, across the wreckage of the penthouse, across the bodies and the broken glass and the chemical haze still hanging in the air like a ghost, something passed between them that was beyond language, beyond strategy, beyond the architecture of lies and leverage that had defined every moment of their relationship. She shook her head, barely, a movement so small only he would see it. "Don't." Dominic's bloody mouth opened. His voice came out raw, broken, barely human. "Maren, don't give him anything." Crane's men tightened their grip on her arms. She didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on Dominic's across the room, steady and burning and absolutely certain, and Maren's voice cut through the ruined penthouse like a scalpel through infected tissue. Clean, precise, and absolutely irreversible. "Don't give him anything. Give." Crane turned to look at her. The empty smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes recalculated. A flicker of recalibration, the micro-expression of a strategist encountering a variable he'd underestimated. He walked toward her slowly, his shoes crunching over broken glass with the deliberate rhythm of a man who wanted her to hear every step. He stopped 18 inches from her face, close enough that she could see the pores on his skin, the thin scar beneath his left ear, the absolute absence of warmth in his eyes. He held up the hard drive between two fingers like a playing card. "You collected the originals, not Crane's copies. The originals from your father's safety deposit box. First National, Box 1847. He watched her face for the reaction. She gave him nothing. "Oh yes, I've known about the box for months. I just couldn't access it. Your father used biometric authentication, his fingerprint, and a key. I had neither. But you, resourceful girl, you retrieved it for me." He tucked the drive back into his jacket pocket and leaned closer. His breath was cold, medicinal, the breath of a man who consumed things without tasting them. "I didn't need to steal the files. I just needed someone desperate enough and clever enough to do it for me." Crane gives you the copies at the gala. Enough truth to make you doubt everything. Enough poison to send you running to Daddy. And Daddy, predictable as always, tells you exactly where the originals are. You walk into the bank. You walk out with the leverage I've spent 2 years trying to acquire. The realization hit Maren like a collision. Not a single impact, but a cascading series of failures, dominoes falling through the architecture of every decision she'd made since the gala. The thumb drive, the trip to Lake Geneva, the conversation with her father, the safety deposit box. Every step she'd taken toward independence had been a step deeper into Crane's design. She hadn't outsmarted anyone. She'd been the delivery mechanism. Crane read it on her face. The smile widened by exactly 1 millimeter. Don't feel bad. You were working against 2 of the most sophisticated operators in this city with no training, no resources, and no allies. The fact that you got as far as you did is genuinely impressive. In another life, I'd recruit you. From the floor, Dominic's voice, broken, wet with blood, but carrying the specific edge of a man who had processed the same information faster than everyone else in the room and had already moved past the despair into something colder. She's not the one you should be worried about. Crane turned. Dominic was on his knees, held by 2 operatives, his face a mask of blood and swelling. His dislocated arm hung at his side like dead weight, but his right hand, his good hand, was positioned at his waist, fingers resting against his belt buckle with a casualness that Maren recognized instantly. Not relaxed, staged. The gas I put in this ventilation system, Dominic said, his words slightly slurred through split lips. It's not just a sedative, it's a binary compound. The first component puts people to sleep. The second component, the one that activates 90 seconds after the first, is an aerosolized tracking marker. UV reactive, bonds to skin and clothing. Can't be washed off for 72 hours. Crane's expression didn't change, but his breathing did. A subtle acceleration, barely perceptible, the first involuntary response Maren had ever seen from him. Everyone in this room is tagged, Dominic continued. Your men, your gear, your vehicles. You. The moment you leave this building, every surveillance system in my network lights up. Satellite, street level, private, federal. You won't make it to the city limits before every asset I've ever placed in law enforcement knows exactly where you are. You're bluffing. I never bluff. You know that. It's the one thing about me you've always respected. Silence. The ruined penthouse creaked. Stressed glass settling, structural damage announcing itself in small groans and pops. Outside, Chicago glowed, indifferent, its skyline reflected in the shattered remnants of the panoramic windows like a city seen through a broken mirror. Crane was still for 4 seconds, then 5. Maren counted his breathing, faster now, shallow, the rhythm of a man running calculations that weren't producing favorable outcomes. She'd seen this respiration pattern in the ER, in patients whose bodies understood the diagnosis before their minds accepted it. Here's what you're not seeing, Crane said, recovering. The tracking compound is irrelevant if I don't leave. I have 4 men. You're on your knees. Your security is down. I have the files. I have your wife. And I have until sunrise to dismantle every piece of leverage you've ever held. The compound wears off in 72 hours. I can wait. You can't wait, Maren said. Both men looked at her. Her wrists were zip-tied. Her temple was bleeding. Her bare feet were cut from broken glass, and the blood was making small, abstract paintings on the marble floor beneath her. But her voice carried the flat diagnostic certainty of a trauma nurse delivering a prognosis that couldn't be argued with. Before the dinner, I made a phone call. Helen Kazarian, investigative reporter, Chicago Tribune. I told her I had financial records linking a criminal organization to public officials. I told her I'd deliver the files at a meeting tomorrow. When I don't show up, when I disappear from a penthouse that's now a crime scene with blown-out doors and unconscious bodies and security footage that Dominic's off-site servers are recording right now, she doesn't get files. She gets a story. And the story is that Elias Crane attacked a private residence, assaulted federal contacts, and kidnapped a woman. That story runs with or without the hard drive in your pocket. Crane stared at her. The emptiness in his expression cracked, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who didn't know where to look, but Maren saw it. A fracture line running through the mask, the first structural failure she'd ever witnessed in his composure. "You're a nurse," he said. "You don't make plays like this." "I'm a nurse who's been trapped in a room with two of the most dangerous men in Chicago for 6 weeks. You learn fast or you die." I learned fast. Crane looked at Dominic. Dominic looked at Maren. Maren looked at both of them and felt for the first time since the black armored car pulled up to the emergency entrance of Mercy General the specific sensation of standing on level ground. Not safe ground, not solid ground, but level. 3 people, 3 agendas. 3 weapons aimed in different directions. A standoff built on tracking compounds and stolen files and a journalist's phone number and the terrible, clarifying knowledge that none of them could destroy the others without destroying themselves. "So," Maren said, "now we negotiate." Itim chachakiaugt. The negotiation lasted until 4 a.m. Not at the dining table. That was destroyed. Not in Dominic's office. Crane refused to enter a room with a single exit. They sat in the kitchen, the 4 of them. Crane, Dominic, Maren, and Novak, who had regained consciousness 20 minutes after the gas dissipated, sporting a concussion and a split lip, and the murderous expression of a man who intended to kill someone before the sun came up and was exercising considerable restraint in choosing who. Crane's men were zip-tied in the service corridor. The unconscious guests had been moved to bedrooms. The federal contacts had been evacuated through the parking garage with a cover story involving a gas leak that nobody believed but everyone accepted, because the alternative was admitting they'd attended a dinner party hosted by a crime lord that had been raided by a rival crime lord while they ate lamb. Dominic sat at the kitchen island with his dislocated arm in a makeshift sling Maren had fashioned from a dish towel and 2 wooden spoons. A field splint, ugly but functional, applied with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had treated worse injuries with fewer resources. She'd popped the shoulder back into the socket herself, one hand on his scapula and one on his wrist, counting down from 3 and pulling on 2 because she knew from experience that patients braced on the expected number. Dominic had made no sound when the joint relocated. His jaw locked and his eyes went white, and his good hand gripped the countertop so hard the marble cracked beneath his fingers. But he didn't scream. She filed that away in the growing catalog of things about him that impressed and frightened her in equal measure. Crane sat opposite them. Composed again, or performing composure, the distinction was academic. The hard drive sat on the counter between them like an unexploded ordnance. "Terms," Maren said. She was the one speaking, not Dominic, not Crane, her, because she was the only person at this table who had nothing to gain from lying, and all 3 of them knew it. "The files are destroyed. All copies. Crane's versions. My father's originals. Whatever Dominic has stored in his systems. All of it. Every transaction record, every shell company document, every name. Gone." "That eliminates my leverage," Crane said. "That's the point. It eliminates everyone's leverage. No one holds the files. No one can use them. The weapon ceases to exist." "And what guarantees my safety once the leverage is gone?" "The same thing that guarantees everyone's safety. Mutual destruction is replaced by mutual silence. You know enough to bury Dominic. Dominic knows enough to bury you. My father knows enough to bury both of you. And I know enough to bury all 3. We're all holding knives to each other's throats. The only way anyone survives is if everyone puts the knives down at the same time." Crane considered this. His fingers drummed against the counter, the first nervous habit she'd ever seen from him, a rhythmic tapping that sounded like a very small clock counting down. "And the restructuring? Dominic's network?" Dominic spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. His voice was wrecked, sandpaper over gravel, but the words were precise. "I'm going legitimate. Fully. The criminal channels close. The trafficking connections you built are already dismantled. The remaining operations convert to legal holdings over the next 18 months. I don't need a war. I need a transition." "And my operations?" "Your operations are your problem. But if you touch Chicago again, my city, my people, my wife, there won't be a negotiation. There'll be a body." The word hung in the air. Not a threat. A geographical fact. Chicago was Dominic's in the way that a body belongs to its skeleton. Structurally, fundamentally, beneath the surface of everything visible. Crane's drumming stopped. He looked at Maren. "And you? What do you want?" Maren held his gaze. Her wrists were still raw from the zip ties. Her feet were still bleeding. Her head ached from the impact against the wall. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. The bone-deep depletion of a woman who had been performing, plotting, surviving, and fighting for 6 continuous weeks without a single moment of genuine rest. I want my father released. New identity. Full protection. No surveillance, no containment, no controlled phone calls. He walks free, and he stays free. Your father is a criminal. My father is a man who made terrible choices and will spend the rest of his life living with them. That's punishment enough. He doesn't need a cage. And if he talks? He won't, because if he talks, he incriminates himself. The mutual silence protects him too. Crane looked at the hard drive, looked at Dominic, looked at Maren, looked at Novak, who had said nothing the entire negotiation but whose hand rested on the butt of a pistol beneath the counter with the casual readiness of a man waiting for permission. One additional condition, Crane said. I leave Chicago tonight. No tracking. The compound, whatever Dominic put in the ventilation system. I need a decontamination protocol. There is no compound, Dominic said. The room went still. Crane's expression fractured. Not a crack this time, Set. A full structural collapse. The mask falling away to reveal the face of a man who had just realized he'd been outplayed by a lie so simple it was invisible. There's no tracking marker, Dominic said. There never was. The ventilation system dispenses a sedative. That's it. One component, one function. I told you it was binary because you needed to believe you were trapped. You needed to sit at this table and negotiate instead of fighting your way out. And you did. Silence. Maren stared at Dominic. He stared back. And in his bloody, swollen, broken face, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not the predator, not the strategist, not the wounded lover. She saw the gambler, the man who had bet everything, his empire, his body, his future, on a bluff delivered from his knees with blood running down his chin, because the alternative was watching Crane walk out with the files and his wife's freedom and every piece of leverage that mattered. He'd lied. Brilliantly. Desperately. With the specific genius of a man who understood that the most powerful weapon in any negotiation wasn't information, it was the other person's fear of what you might know. Crane stood. His chair scraped against the tile. His composure reassembled itself. Slower this time, more deliberate, the reconstruction of a facade that would never quite fit the same way again. The terms stand, he said. Files destroyed. Mutual silence. I leave Chicago. And my father, Maren said. And your father. Crane picked up the hard drive, held it for a moment, then set it back on the counter and slid it toward Maren with 2 fingers. Destroy it yourself. I don't want to touch the thing that nearly killed all of us. He walked toward the service corridor, paused, turned back. Dominic. One last thing. Dominic looked up. She's not your weakness. She never was. She's the reason you survived tonight. If you're smart, and you are, you'll stop trying to control her and start trying to deserve her. He left. His men were cut free. They exited through the parking garage. The sound of engines faded into the pre-dawn silence, and then there was nothing. Just the damaged penthouse, and the broken glass and the distant sirens of a city that had no idea what had happened 70 stories above it. Mike. Maren set Dominic's shoulder properly at 5 a.m. She made him sit on the kitchen floor because the dining chairs were destroyed and the countertops were too high. She used actual medical supplies, retrieved from the first aid kit she'd stocked in the bathroom during her second week, because she was a trauma nurse and stocking medical supplies in her environment was as instinctive as breathing. She irrigated the cut above his eyebrow, butterflied it closed, applied pressure bandages to the lacerations on his forearms, checked his pupils for signs of concussion, palpated his ribs, 2 cracked, possibly 3, with fingers that were steady and professional, and touched him the way they'd touch any patient, which meant gently but without tenderness, clinically but without coldness. He sat still through all of it, didn't speak, watched her hands move across his injuries with an expression that could have been gratitude or wonder or grief or all 3 at once. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. Really looked. Not the way she'd looked at him across negotiation tables and dining rooms and 70-story windows, but the way she looked at patients after the crisis had passed and the adrenaline had faded and there was nothing left except the raw, undeniable reality of what had happened. You lied about the tracking compound. Yes. You lied to save me. I lied to save both of us. And the other lies? The contract? The arrangement? My father? Dominic was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was gray with pre-dawn light. Somewhere below, a garbage truck ground through the streets. The same sound Maren had heard on their first morning in the penthouse. The mundane machinery of a city that never stopped functioning, regardless of what happened inside the buildings above it. Your father was already working for me when I approached you, Dominic said. He'd been contained for 4 months. The files were a genuine threat. Not to me specifically, but to the restructuring. I needed them secured. I needed him cooperative. And I needed a reason to keep him alive that his enemies would respect. A wife. A wife. Yes. A wife created political alliances, financial protections, and a personal motivation that made my protection of Gordon credible. Crane couldn't kill your father without provoking a response from a man defending his wife's family. The marriage made the protection real. But that's not why you did it. Dominic's good hand rested on his knee. The knuckles were swollen, purple-black, the skin split over the first and second metacarpals. He looked at his hand the way a man looks at a tool he's used past its breaking point. 8 months before I approached you. The rain, the hospital, the patient on the bench. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the authority and the strategy and the careful architecture of power, reduced to something that sounded almost ordinary, almost human. I'd just come from a meeting where I'd ordered the destruction of a man's business because he missed a payment deadline by 3 days. I was sitting in the back of that car, and I watched you give your umbrella to a dying stranger and stand with him in the rain, and I actually thought, that if I could have one person in my life who did things like that, maybe I wouldn't become the thing I was turning into. He looked up at her. Blood had dried in the creases around his eyes, and the butterfly strips above his brow pulled his skin slightly, giving his expression a lopsided vulnerability that no amount of composure could mask. So I used your father as leverage to bring you into my life. I manipulated your desperation. I constructed an arrangement designed to make leaving incrementally more difficult and staying incrementally more natural. I did all of that. It was calculated, and it was deliberate, and it was wrong, and I would do it again because the alternative was never knowing you, and I am not strong enough for that. Maren sat on the cold kitchen floor in torn clothes with glass cuts on her feet and bandage adhesive on her fingers, and looked at the most dangerous man in Chicago, confessing to her from his knees, and felt the hairline fracture in her chest. The one that had been widening since the gala, since Lake Geneva, since the night she'd read 400 documents on a bathroom floor, finally break through, not collapse, not shatter, break through. The way a bone that's been set wrong has to be broken again to heal correctly. She was crying. She hadn't authorized it. The tears came silently, without sobs, tracking down her cheeks and falling onto the backs of her hands, and she let them come because she was too exhausted to stop them, and too honest to pretend they weren't happening. I can't trust you, she said. I know. You manipulated every choice I've made since the night we met. Yes. And you do it again. Yes. And I hate that about myself. But I won't lie about it, not anymore. That's not enough, Dominic. I know. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, took a breath, let it out. Another. The ER breathing protocol applied one final time to the wreckage of everything. I'm going to leave, she said. Not forever, but for a while. I need to be somewhere that isn't yours. I need to make a decision that isn't shaped by your proximity or your resources or the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Where will you go? I don't know yet, and I'm not going to tell you. That's the point. He nodded, slowly. The nod of a man accepting a verdict he knew was coming and had been dreading with every cell in his body. The ring, he said. Maren looked at the diamond on her left hand. It caught the gray morning light and threw a small rainbow on the kitchen wall. A tiny, fractured spectrum that looked almost like hope if you squinted at it from the right angle. She slid it off her finger, held it for a moment in her palm. Then she placed it on the counter between them. Not a return, not a rejection, but a pause. A piece of punctuation in a sentence that hadn't ended yet. Hold on to it, she said. I'll decide what to do with it when I know what I want. Not what you want. Not what my father wants. Not what the arrangement requires. What I want. Dominic picked up the ring, closed his fist around it. The diamond disappeared inside his bruised, broken hand, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was. A man holding a small, bright thing in a dark room, afraid to squeeze too tight, afraid to let go. 3 days later, Maren drove south, not in an armored SUV, not in a rented sedan registered to a colleague, in her own car. A 12-year-old Honda Civic she'd bought in medical school, retrieved from the hospital parking garage where it had been sitting for 6 weeks collecting dust and parking tickets. The engine coughed twice before turning over. The heater worked intermittently. The passenger seat was buried under old textbooks and empty coffee cups, and a stethoscope she'd forgotten she'd left there. It was the most beautiful car she'd ever driven. She took I-57 south through flat, frozen farmland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The sky was enormous, gray-white, featureless, the kind of Midwestern sky that made you feel simultaneously insignificant and free. She drove for 4 hours without stopping, the radio off, the windows cracked an inch to let the cold air in because she needed to feel something on her skin that was real and uncontrolled and not engineered by anyone for any purpose. Her father was already gone. Dominic had arranged the release the morning after the negotiation. A car, a driver, a new identity, a one-way ticket to a coastal town she would learn the name of only when Maren Alcott called her from a payphone 3 weeks later, his voice thin and hesitant, like a man testing whether a bridge would hold his weight. "Maren, I'm here. I'm safe. I know. I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect so. I know, Dad." A pause. The sound of seagulls on his end. Wind. Water. "Are you okay?" She'd thought about the question for a long time before answering, not because she didn't know, but because the answer was complicated in a way that resisted simple language. "I'm getting there." She settled in a town called Marion, downstate Illinois, population 12,000, where nobody knew her name and nobody drove armored vehicles, and the tallest building was a grain elevator that caught the sunset like a golden monolith every evening at 6. She rented a one-bedroom above a hardware store. The radiator worked. The landlord was a 70-year-old woman named Dolores, who asked no questions and left jars of homemade peach preserves on the landing every Thursday. Maren got a job at the regional hospital, ER, of course, smaller than Mercy General, quieter, the kind of place where the staff knew each other's children's names, and the trauma cases were farm accidents and car wrecks rather than gunshot wounds. She worked. She slept. She painted watercolors in the evening, the farmland, the sky, the grain elevator at sunset, and tacked them to the kitchen wall without judging them. She didn't call Dominic, he didn't call her. The silence between them stretched like a held breath, and in that silence, Maren discovered something she hadn't expected. The absence of Dominic Vasaro was not relief. It was not freedom. It was a specific kind of ache, dull, persistent, located somewhere beneath her sternum, that she recognized from years of clinical experience as the sensation of a wound healing correctly. It hurt because it was working. It hurt because the tissue was knitting itself back together in a new configuration, stronger than before, shaped differently, capable of bearing weight it couldn't bear when it was broken. She thought about him constantly, not with longing, or not only with longing, with the analytical intensity she applied to difficult cases. She dissected his decisions the way she dissected symptoms, looking for the underlying pathology, the root cause, the thing beneath the thing. A man who'd had his wrist broken by his own father at 14 and had never shown the scar to anyone until he showed it to her in a dark kitchen at 2 a.m. A man who'd built an empire out of control because control was the only language his childhood had taught him. A man who'd seen a nurse give her umbrella to a dying stranger and thought, if I could have that, if I could be near that, maybe I'd survive. Not a good man, not a safe man, but a man in the process of becoming something, and the process was genuine, and the process had started before he met her, and the process would continue whether she was there or not. The question was whether she wanted to be there for it. Tick. 2 months passed. The hard drive was destroyed. Maren had done it herself in the penthouse kitchen the morning before she left. She'd placed it on the marble counter and hit it with a meat tenderizer until the casing cracked, then removed the platters and scored them with a box cutter, then put the fragments in a metal bowl and poured acetone over them and set it on fire in the kitchen sink. Dominic watched from the doorway. Novak watched from the hallway. Neither of them spoke. The fire burned blue-white for 40 seconds, and then there was nothing left but slag and smoke and the faint chemical smell of a weapon being permanently decommissioned. The files were gone, all copies. Crane's, Gordon's, Dominic's. The evidence that had driven every decision, every betrayal, every manipulation for 4 years ceased to exist in the form of a small fire in a luxury kitchen, watched by a trauma nurse, a crime lord, and a security chief with a concussion. Dominic restructured. Maren followed the news from Marion, not the tabloids, which were useless, but the financial press, which was not. Vasaro Holdings divested from 3 shipping companies linked to questionable operations. A real estate portfolio was restructured under new compliance frameworks. 2 of Dominic's political contacts quietly retired from public office, which meant the leveraged relationships were being dismantled from both ends. He was doing it, not performatively, not strategically, actually doing it. The transition from criminal empire to legitimate enterprise was slow, painful, expensive, and real. Elias Crane disappeared from Chicago entirely. The Tribune ran a small item about a private equity firm dissolving its Midwest operations. No charges, no investigation, just a quiet withdrawal, the way a tide recedes, slowly, completely, leaving behind the wreckage it created for others to clean up. The mutual silence held. It held because it had to. Because every person involved understood that breaking it meant destroying themselves alongside everyone else. And self-preservation, that most fundamental of human instincts, was the only contract that didn't require a signature. On a Tuesday evening in March, Maren finished a 12-hour shift, drove home through a light rain, climbed the stairs to her apartment above the hardware store, and found a package on her doorstep. Small, no return address, no postmark, delivered by hand. Inside, a tube of watercolor paint, cerulean blue, professional grade. The exact brand and shade she'd used in college, the one she'd been unable to find in Marion because it was imported from a small manufacturer in England and not stocked by any art supply store within 200 miles. No note. Maren held the tube of paint and stood in her doorway and looked out at the rain falling over the small, quiet town that had become her refuge and thought about a man who memorized the brand of paint she used and the shade she preferred and had somehow, from 300 miles away, found and delivered the one thing she needed without attaching a message or a demand or a condition. A gift with no strings. The first thing Dominic Vasaro had ever given her that asked for nothing in return. She went inside, set the paint on her kitchen table beside the watercolors she'd been working on, sat down, looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone, dialed a number she'd memorized but never saved. It rang 3 times. Maren, his voice, quieter than she remembered, less controlled, the voice of a man who had been waiting for a phone to ring and had stopped believing it would. "The paint," she said. "How did you know I needed cerulean?" A pause. "You always run out of blue first. Your skies take up half the canvas." She laughed. It came out without permission. A real laugh, not a performance, not a negotiation tactic, just the involuntary sound of a woman who'd been alone with her own seriousness for 2 months and had forgotten what it felt like to be known by someone. "I'm not ready to come back," she said. "I know. I might not come back. I know that too. But I wanted you to know I'm painting again. Real painting. Not the stressed, angry stuff I did in the penthouse. Actual work. The kind I used to do before everything." Silence on the line. She could hear him breathing. Steady, controlled, but with a slight irregularity at the end of each exhale, the kind of tremor you'd only notice if you'd spent years listening to people breathe in crisis. "That's good," he said. "That's really good." "Dominic." "Yes." "The ring. Do you still have it?" "I'm holding it right now." She closed her eyes, pressed the phone against her ear. Let the silence expand between them, not the cold, strategic silence of the penthouse, not the wounded silence of the kitchen floor, but a new kind, a patient kind. The silence of 2 people who had hurt each other and survived it, and were now standing on opposite sides of a distance they'd both chosen, deciding whether to close it. "Keep holding it," she said. "I'll let you know." She hung up, set the phone on the table, picked up the cerulean blue and opened the cap and squeezed a small amount onto her palette and began to paint. Outside the window, the rain fell over Marion, Illinois, soft and steady and indifferent to the woman painting inside the small apartment above the hardware store. She painted the sky first. She always painted the sky first. Wide, enormous. The kind of sky that made you feel insignificant and free in equal measure. She used all the blue. 6 weeks later, Maren Alcott drove north. The Honda Civic still coughed on ignition. The heater still worked intermittently. The passenger seat was clean now. Textbooks donated to the hospital library, coffee cups thrown away, stethoscope hung on a hook by the apartment door. In their place sat a single canvas, wrapped in brown paper, leaning against the seatback. She took I-57 to I-94. The landscape shifted from farmland to suburb to city. The slow accretion of concrete and steel and human density that meant Chicago was approaching. The skyline appeared on the horizon like a jawline breaking through fog, and Maren watched it grow larger and felt something in her chest that wasn't fear and wasn't excitement, but some compound of both, some alloy forged in the space between what she'd survived and what she was choosing. She parked the Civic in the underground garage of the penthouse tower. The attendant didn't recognize her. She walked to the elevator, pressed 70. The doors opened. The penthouse was different, quieter. The panoramic windows had been replaced. New glass, seamless. The kind of engineering that erased damage so completely it was as if the violence had never happened. But the layout had changed. The formal dining room was gone, converted into an open studio space flooded with natural light. An easel stood near the window. Canvases leaned against the walls. A workbench held tubes of paint organized by color, and in the center of the arrangement, a tube of cerulean blue, the same brand as the one he'd sent to Marion, waiting like a small blue promise. He'd built her a studio, in the exact spot where she'd first entered his world as a stranger, in the room where they'd hosted dinners for criminals and politicians and men whose smiles hid violence. He'd torn it down and rebuilt it for her. Dominic stood in the doorway of his office. He looked different too, thinner. The bruises were gone, but the weight he'd lost during the weeks of recovery hadn't fully returned. He wore a white shirt, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbows. The scar on his wrist was visible. He didn't hide it anymore. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her during the wedding, as though the world had narrowed. But there was something new in it now, something that hadn't been there before. Patience. The specific patience of a man who had learned painfully that the thing he wanted most could not be acquired through strategy or leverage or force. It could only be received. "You came back." "I came to see the studio." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, the ghost of one. And she looked around the room, the light, the canvases, the cerulean blue waiting on the workbench, the view of Chicago through new glass, the skyline she'd painted 100 times from 100 miles away, now close enough to touch. "It's a good start," she said. She unwrapped the canvas she'd carried from the car, a painting. The Chicago skyline seen from a distance, not the sharp architectural rendering of the city she'd painted in the penthouse, but something softer, more impressionistic, the buildings half dissolved in rain and light, recognizable but transformed. The way you remember a place you've been away from long enough to see it honestly. She set it against the wall beneath the window, stepped back. Dominic looked at the painting for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and produced the ring, held it out on his open palm. Not offered, not presented, just held. Available. The choice entirely hers. Maren looked at the diamond, looked at his hand, looked at his face, this complicated, dangerous, broken, rebuilding face, and felt the fracture in her chest finish its work. Not healed, remodeled, stronger in the broken places, the way bone is, the way all living things are when they survive the thing that should have destroyed them. She took the ring from his palm, held it between her thumb and forefinger, studied it the way she'd studied it in the back of the armored car on the night they met, a lifetime ago, a different woman ago. Then she slid it onto her finger, slowly, deliberately, a choice made with full knowledge of who he was and what he'd done and what it cost and what it meant. Dominic exhaled. A single breath, the sound of a man who had been holding his lungs still for months, finally allowing them to work. She stepped forward, placed her hands on either side of his face, carefully, the way she handled fragile things, the way she handled wounds. Her thumbs rested against his cheekbones. His skin was warm. "I'm not the woman you pulled into that car," she said. "I'm not the woman who signed your contract. I'm not the woman who hid in your walls or carried your secrets or performed for your dinner guests. I'm the woman who came back knowing everything and chose to be here anyway. That's different. That has to be different. It's different. If you lie to me again, I know. If you try to control me, I know. If you move my painting without asking," he laughed, quiet, broken, real. The first genuine laugh she'd ever heard from him, and it sounded like something being unlocked, a door opening in a room that had been sealed for decades. She kissed him. Not the performance kiss of the wedding, not the desperate kiss of the battlefield. A slow, deliberate, clear-eyed kiss between two people who had destroyed each other and rebuilt each other, and understood finally that love between damaged people was not a fairy tale. It was an engineering project. It required maintenance. It required honesty. It required the daily, unglamorous work of choosing someone whose flaws you could see with surgical precision and deciding every morning to stay anyway. Outside, Chicago spread beneath them in the late afternoon light. Vast, complicated, beautiful in the way that all broken things are beautiful when you stop pretending they're not broken. The lake glittered. The traffic crawled. The city breathed its 10 million breaths and went on living the way it always had, indifferent to the two people standing 70 stories above it in a room full of new glass and fresh paint and the complicated, imperfect, hard-won beginning of something that had no name and needed no contract and would never, ever be simple. Maren Alcott stood in the studio Dominic Vasaro had built for her and looked at the skyline she'd painted from 300 miles away and felt, for the first time in her adult life, the specific sensation of being exactly where she chose to be. Not trapped, not rescued, not contained or controlled or leveraged or performed, present. And in the city that once feared Dominic Vasaro above all other men, the most dangerous thing about him was never his empire or his violence or the quiet authority with which he moved through rooms full of powerful men. It was the woman who taught him that the hardest thing a man like him would ever do was open his hands and let someone choose to stay.